The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, before Silas Redfern had finished his first cup of coffee. He didn't open it right away. He recognized the letterhead North Fork Development Syndicate, printed in ink so dark and deliberate, it looked like a threat before you read a single word. He set it on the kitchen table, face down, and went out to check on the horses. He fed them. He patched a section of fence that had been leaning wrong for 3 weeks. He came back inside, poured the coffee that had gone cold, and stood there looking at that envelope like it might bite him. Then he turned it over and broke the seal. It has come to our attention that the water rights associated with the creek running through the northeastern boundary of your property, filed under territorial claim dated March 1884, may in fact belong to the North Fork Development Syndicate, pursuant to prior survey agreements made with the original land office. We urge you to consider a voluntary cessation of use pending formal resolution. Failure to comply may result in legal proceedings that we are confident will resolve in our favor. We have no interest in causing unnecessary hardship to a man in your circumstances. We simply ask that you do the right thing. Silas read it twice, then a third time. His hand was not shaking. He was not the kind of man whose hand shook. But something went cold and still inside his chest, the way a pond freezes from the edges in slow, quiet, and then suddenly all the way through. That creek was everything. The garden, the livestock, the well in dry summer months. Without that water, the farm didn't fail slowly. It failed completely. He folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, set it exactly where it had been, face down, like if he didn't look at it, the problem might decide to go somewhere else. Then Nellie walked in, wearing one boot and carrying the other. Because the lace had snapped again and her small fingers couldn't thread the replacement, and she looked up at him with those serious brown eyes she'd inherited from her mother, and said, "Papa, my boot." And Silas Redfern, a man who had buried his wife, kept a mortgaged farm alive through 2 brutal winters, and just been told by a company full of lawyers that they intended to take his water, sat down on the floor of his own kitchen and fixed his daughter's bootlace. Because that's what you do. You fix what's in front of you, even when everything behind it is falling apart. If you've ever been handed something official-looking that was designed to make you feel small, to make you believe that someone powerful already owns what you thought was yours, then you already understand. What Silas felt sitting on that cold kitchen floor. Most of its windows were dark, and if you've ever had someone unexpected walk through your door and quietly change everything, then you need to stay with this story, because that's exactly what happened next. Before we go further, if this kind of story speaks to you, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. You'd be surprised where these voices reach. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The winter of 1891 came early to the Idaho Territory, which was the kind of thing people said every year. But that particular year actually meant it. Cold arrived in October with a seriousness that made old-timers go quiet at the general store, and younger men check their woodpile twice. Silas Redfern's woodpile was not where it needed to be. Neither was most of his farm. He was 41 years old and looked 48, which is what 3 years of grief will do to a man who refuses to stop working long enough to feel it. His wife, Margaret, had died in the autumn of 1888, just after the harvest, and Silas had decided at some point between the funeral and the following spring that the best way to keep from falling apart was to stay in motion. Fix something. Build something. Keep your hands busy. Don't let the silence get too loud. The problem with that strategy is that one man cannot do everything. Could not fix a fence and repair a roof and tend the animals and manage the crops and do the accounts and shift and also raise a 7-year-old girl who needed someone to sew her seams and brush her hair and notice when she'd gone quiet for too long. Nellie was not a difficult child. That was almost the harder thing. A difficult child would have demanded attention, would have thrown fits, would have made noise about what she needed. Instead, Nellie Redfern had watched her father grieve and then kept watch over him, quietly, in the way that children sometimes understand is the only help they can offer. She learned to manage with the coat that was a little too thin. She ate without complaint. She picked up after herself before her father could see the mess. She was 7 years old and already practicing the art of not being a burden. Silas knew this, It was one of the things that kept him awake at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling boards, doing math he couldn't make add up. The farm's mortgage with the bank in Clearwater was $430. The harvest had come in short. He had sold 2 horses in September, and still the numbers refused to cooperate. And his daughter's winter coat had a tear in the left sleeve that he'd tried to mend himself in October and made worse. And every time he looked at it, he felt a specific and particular shame that was different from any of his other failures. It was the coat Margaret would have fixed in an hour. It was the coat that proved, in some way, Silas couldn't have articulated, that this household needed something he didn't know how to give. He wrote to the employment agency in Boise in November. He was not good at asking for help. He addressed the letter 3 times before he got the wording right. He wrote a capable woman who could manage a household in frontier conditions. Not delicate, not inexperienced, someone practical. He didn't say he was lonely. He didn't say his daughter had gotten quieter and quieter since September. He said he needed help with domestic duties and was prepared to offer room, board, and reasonable wages. The agency wrote back inside of 2 weeks. They had a candidate. Her name was Lenora Whitcomb, 31 years old, formerly a school teacher in Columbus, Ohio. And then the woman at the agency had written something that Silas read twice, the same way he'd later read that letter from the syndicate. We feel it is our professional obligation to inform you that Miss Whitcomb is, in our estimation, somewhat overqualified for a domestic position. She has strong opinions and does not hesitate to express them. We have placed her with 2 previous households, and in both cases she departed within 6 months not from failure to perform her duties, but from what our clients described as a certain difficulty accommodating her perspective on how things ought to be done. We present her qualifications honestly and leave the decision to your judgment. Silas read that paragraph a 3rd time. Then he wrote back and said he'd take her. His neighbor, a man named Cobb Darnell, who had strong opinions about everything, including other people's decisions, told him he was making a mistake. A woman who left 2 households, Cobb said, leaning against the fence line that separated their properties, chewing on something he probably should have spit out. That's not a woman who works well with others, Redfern. The agency said she left because people didn't like her opinions. Right. And I need someone who knows what she's doing, not someone who knows how to make me comfortable. Cobb looked at him for a moment. That's the loneliness talking. Maybe, Silas said. She starts the 15th. What he didn't tell Cobb, because it wasn't the kind of thing you told a neighbor who already had too much material to work with, was that the agency's warning had actually been the thing that decided him. 2 previous households had found her difficult to accommodate, which meant she'd had her own ideas about how things should work, which meant she was actually thinking, not just doing what she was told. On a struggling farm in the Idaho winter, a woman who actually thought was worth more than 10 women who complied. At least that was what he told himself on the 3-mile ride to collect her from the stage, stop in Cartwell Crossing. He was nervous. He would not have admitted that either. Lenora Whitcomb arrived with 1 trunk, a satchel, and the expression of a woman who had been traveling for 4 days and was not going to apologize for any of it. She was not what he'd imagined. He'd imagined someone older somehow, someone whose edges had been worn down. Instead, she was sharp-featured and direct-eyed, with dark hair pinned practically under a gray wool hat that had clearly seen better winters, and she looked at the wagon and at Silas, and at the flat, cold landscape around Cartwell Crossing seen with a single measuring sweep of her eyes, as if she were already calculating what she'd need to know. "Mr. Redfern," she said. "Not a question, Miss Whitcomb." He took her trunk. It was heavier than he expected. He didn't comment on that. She climbed onto the wagon without waiting for assistance. He noticed that. Not because it surprised him he'd expected someone capable, but because there was something deliberate about it, like she was establishing something. They rode for the first mile in silence. The wind was doing what Idaho wind does in November, which is, mind you, that it answers to no one. Finally, Lenora said, "The agency told you I'm difficult." It wasn't a question either. He was noticing a pattern. They said you have strong opinions. That's a polite way to say the same thing. She looked straight ahead at the road. "I want you to know what that means before we get to your property, because I don't think it's fair to take someone's wages and then surprise them with who you are. I taught school for 9 years. I was let go because the board decided an unmarried woman with a college education was setting a bad example for the girls in her class by being too. She paused, and he could hear the precise restraint in her voice, intellectually ambitious. They fired you for being too educated? They fired me for making the girls believe that being educated was something worth wanting. She paused. Same thing, I suppose, from their perspective. Silas thought about that. He watched the road. I have a daughter, I know. The agency mentioned it. She's 7. He started, and then stopped because he'd been about to say quiet, and that didn't cover it, not nearly. She's had a hard 3 years. Her mother died. Lenora turned and looked at him then, directly which he hadn't expected. People usually offered condolences in the middle distance. She looked at him like she was actually seeing him. What was her name, Margaret? How did Nellie handle it? He thought about the honest answer for a moment. The honest answer was too well, and that the child's quiet cooperation broke his heart more than any crying would have. She's a good girl, he said finally, which wasn't the same answer, and both of them probably knew it. Lenora seemed to let that go. She looked back at the road. I want to understand the household before I start reorganizing it, she said. I'll need a few days to see how you've been managing things. I won't come in and immediately tell you everything you've been doing wrong. Not on the first week, anyway. He wasn't sure if that was a joke. He decided, based on the very slight shift at the corner of her mouth, that it was, and he made a quiet sound that was his version of laughing at something. The agency said not to expect a welcome from the frontier, she continued. I grew up on a farm in eastern Ohio. I'm not afraid of work or cold or silence. And mud, he said, come spring. Especially mud, she said. They rode the rest of the way to the farm in a silence that was somehow different from the first silence. Less like two strangers, more like two people who'd agreed to something without spelling it out. Nellie was standing on the porch when they arrived. This had not been Silas's instruction. He'd told her to stay inside where it was warm. She had apparently decided that instructions applied to situations her father had fully anticipated, and this one he hadn't. She stood there in her thin coat, with a torn sleeve, barefoot. On the cold porch board, she'd taken her boots off at the door, like always, because mud, and she stared at Lenora Whitcomb with the specific gravity that only small children and very old people can manage, completely, without pretense, without any attempt to seem casual about it. Lenora climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the porch and stopped at the bottom step. She did not say, "Oh, aren't you just precious?" She did not say, "Well, hello there, little one." She did not tilt her head or soften her voice into the register, adults use when they're performing warmth for a child, rather than actually feeling it. She said, "You must be Nellie. I've been on a stage for 4 days and my back hurts, and I would very much like a cup of hot water if you have any. Would that be possible?" Nellie blinked. This was clearly not what she'd prepared for. "We have tea," she said. "Even better." And that was how it started. There was no dramatic first evening. That is the thing that doesn't fit the story people expect. There was no moment of instant connection, no tears, no sudden warmth flooding the drafty old farmhouse. Silas had half expected Nellie to be shy, maybe even resistant. He'd been prepared to smooth things over. Instead, Nellie made Lenora tea and then sat at the kitchen table, watching her drink it, with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. Lenora drank the tea, said it was good, and asked Nellie whether she'd been the one to manage the tea tin or whether her father kept track of it. "Keep track," Nellie said. "Papa forgets, I see." Lenora set down the cup. "Is there a household list? What needs doing tomorrow? Or this week?" Nellie looked at her father. Silas looked at Lenora. "There's not exactly a list," he said. "We'll make one," Lenora said. She did not say this with judgment. She said it the way you'd say we'll need to get more firewood, like it was simply the next practical step. After supper, if Nellie wants to help. Nellie said, "I want to help." And then, because the child had a practicality that would have made Margaret laugh, she pulled a stub of pencil from her dress pocket and set it on the table. She'd been carrying it since morning. She'd prepared. Silas looked at his daughter. He thought she was ready for this. She was ready before I was. He turned away so neither of them would see his expression, and he went to see about feeding the horses. The first thing Lenora noticed, the thing she kept to herself for 3 days before she said anything, was the gap under the front door. It wasn't a small gap. It was a full half-inch, maybe more, running the entire width of the door frame, And every time the wind hit the north side of the house, which in November was always cold, air moved through that gap, like the house was breathing in the wrong direction. She could see it in the way the braided rag rug shifted slightly when a gust came. She could feel it when she stood in the kitchen. She'd grown up in a farmhouse with a door exactly like this, and she knew that by January that gap would cost them a third of their firewood. Fighting cold didn't have to let in. She waited 3 days because she didn't know Silas well enough yet to know how he took correction. Some men heard a practical observation as an insult. She needed to see how he operated before she started pointing at his failures. What she saw was this: he worked hard, he worked long, and he made decisions by going at problems directly rather than planning around them. He had a kind of stubborn competence that got things done, but also meant he was always reacting to the last thing that broke rather than preventing the next. He'd kept this farm alive on will. You could see it in the state of everything functional but thin, like the household had been running on fumes and determination for 3 years. She saw how sick he looked at Nellie, the guilt in it. The love that had been living next door to helplessness. For so long it had started to look like them. On the 3rd day, she said, "The gap under your front door. Can I address that?" He looked at the door, then at her. "What gap?" She pointed. He went and crouched down and looked at it. She watched his expression go from confused to resigned to, and this was the thing that told her most about who he was: embarrassed. Not angry, embarrassed. "I should have caught that," he said. "You've been managing alone. You can't catch everything. What do you need to fix it?" She told him. He had most of it. She showed him what to do, and then stepped back and let him do it. Because that was also something she'd learned: when a man feels embarrassed about something on his own property, the kindest thing is to give him the chance to be the one who fixes it. The gap was sealed before supper. That night the house was noticeably warmer. Not dramatically. Not in some way that would make a good story at the general store. Just noticeably. The kind of warmer where you stop thinking about being cold and start thinking about other things. Nellie noticed. She looked up from her slate and said, "It's better in here." "The draft is fixed," Silas said. Nellie looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at her slate. But even with her eyes down, Silas saw something in Lenora's expression that he couldn't quite name, something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same territory. He thought about it later. Lying awake at 2 in the morning, doing his usual accounting of everything unfinished and broken and unpaid. Thought, she's good at this. She's genuinely good. Then he thought up the letter from the North Fork Development Syndicate, still face down on the kitchen table. He'd been trying not to think about that. He failed at not thinking about it. He got up, went to the kitchen, picked up the letter, and read it again in the low light. The language swam at him. Prior survey agreements. Voluntary cessation, legal proceedings we are confident will resolve in our favor. He put the letter back down. He stood in the kitchen that was warmer than it had been 3 days ago. In the farmhouse he'd been fighting to keep since Margaret died. On the land where he planned to raise his daughter, and someday when the debts were smaller and the harvest was better, maybe breathe without the weight of everything pressing down on his ribs. And he thought, they're going to take my water. He stood there in the dark, and he didn't know that the woman sleeping in the back room would change what happened next. He didn't know yet what she was capable of. He didn't know that the thing the agency had warned him about, her opinions, her education, the way she refused to simply comply, was the exact thing that would save him. He only knew his hands were cold. He went back to bed. Coat happened on a Saturday. Lenora had been at the farm for 11 days. She had sealed the door. She had reorganized the pantry in a way that made Silas immediately understand with some chagrin how much he'd been wasting by poor stacking. She had begun giving Nellie formal lessons in the morning's reading, numbers, simple geography, using an old primer that had belonged to Lenora's own schoolroom and that she'd carried in her trunk. On that Saturday, Nellie came inside from the yard and took off her coat, and Lenora saw, for the first time clearly in the morning light, the tear in the left sleeve. The mend that Silas had attempted stitches too large, thread the wrong color. Tension uneven was actually pulling the tear wider. Another week, and the sleeve would be genuinely open. She picked up the coat and looked at the stitching. She looked at Silas. He was at the table. He watched her look at the coat. He watched her look at him. There was a long moment. "I tried," he said. His voice was flat. "I know I'm not," he started and stopped. "I'll fix it," she said. Not don't worry, or it's fine. Just I'll fix it. Like it was the next item on the list, which to her it probably was. She fixed it that afternoon while Nellie did her lessons. When she was finished, it was invisible, not perfect, maybe, not the work of a professional seamstress, but invisible in all the ways that mattered. The sleeve was whole. The coat was warm again. Nellie put it on and turned in a slow circle, feeling the difference. It doesn't have the cold spot anymore, she said. On my arm. No, Lenora said. It shouldn't. Nellie turned and looked at Lenora with an expression that was far too old for 7 years old, a kind of clear-eyed assessment, very still, like she was deciding something. She didn't say anything, but that look Silas had caught the edge of it from across the room, that looks as everything. It said, I'm paying attention to you, I see what you do here, and I've decided. He didn't know it yet, but his daughter had already made up her mind. The rest was just time. The letter stayed face down on the kitchen table for 6 days. Silas kept moving it to the windowsill, back to the table, once to the shelf near the door, but he never put it somewhere. He couldn't see it. That was the thing about a letter like that. You couldn't quite ignore it, and you couldn't quite face it, so you just kept relocating it, like maybe the right position in the room would tell you what to do. Lenora noticed it on day 2. She didn't say anything. She had learned, in 11 days on this farm, that Silas Redfern processed things in a particular sequence. First he ignored them, then he moved them around. Then he got up at 2 in the morning and stood in the kitchen alone. And only after all of that was he ready to talk about whatever it was. Rushing that sequence didn't help. She'd figured that out from watching him with the accounts, with the broken fence on the east side, with a dozen small decisions he'd turned over quietly before acting. So she waited. She sealed another gap she'd found along the base of the north wall. She reorganized how they stored the root vegetables, which had been losing to rot faster than they should. She worked through Nellie's lesson on long numbers, which Nellie found genuinely interesting, and attacked with a focus that made Lenora think, privately, that the child had a mind that deserved far better than the one-room schoolhouse in Cartwell Crossing, which she'd been told had a different teacher every 8 months and a leaking roof. On the evening of the 6th day, Silas picked up the letter, carried it to the table where Lenora was mending a pair of his work gloves, and set it down in front of her without saying anything. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I need someone to read it who isn't me, he said. I've read it too many times. The words don't mean anything anymore. She picked it up. She read it once, straight through, without expression. Then she read it again, slower. He watched her eyes move across the page. He watched her go still in a particular way, not tense, not alarmed, but focused. The way she got when she was working through something. She set it down. How long have you had this? She asked. Since Tuesday of last week? Yes. She looked at the letter again, not at him. And the creek, it's referring to the one on the northeastern boundary. That's the one I pull from for the garden in summer. The livestock water in the lower pasture runs from that same source. If I lose access to it, he stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because finishing it meant saying out loud what losing that water actually meant, and he wasn't ready to hear it said in his own voice. If you lose access to it, the farm isn't viable, Lenora said. She said it without softening it, which he'd come to understand was not cruelty, it was respect. She didn't soften things because she didn't think he needed to be protected from the truth. He appreciated that. It didn't make the truth easier, but he appreciated it. That's correct, he said. She tapped the letter once with one finger. They're very confident in this. They're backed by the bank in Clearwater. My bank. She looked up at him. The same bank that holds your mortgage. Yes. And you think I think if a company with ties to the bank I owe $400 to tells me something belongs to them, they probably know what they're talking about. Lenora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the letter. Something moved across her expression, not quite irritation, not quite recognition. Something in between. Mr. Redfern, she said, do you know what this language is? Legal language. Intimidating legal language. It's a particular kind of intimidating legal language, she said. It's the kind that's designed to feel like information when it's actually a question. They say the water rights may belong to them. Not do. May. They say legal proceedings would likely resolve in their favor. Not certainly likely. She tapped the letter again. Every sentence that sounds like a statement is actually a guess dressed up in a suit. He stared at her. You got that from reading it twice. I taught school for 9 years. I read a great deal of official correspondence from boards and administrators, and men who needed to sound more certain than they were. She folded the letter deliberately and set it back on the table. They are guessing, Mr. Redfern. The question is whether their guess is right. How do we find out? The same way you find out anything, she said. You go back to the original document. He blinked. What original document? Your deed, your original territorial water claim, whatever you filed when you established rights to that creek. She looked at him steadily. You did file a claim. When I bought this property in '84. Previous owner had already done some of the work. I had a survey done. He stopped. I have papers in a tin box in the back room. I haven't opened it in years. Would you like to look tonight or tomorrow morning? He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him. There was something slightly unnerving about the way she could just wait, like a woman who had spent years in a classroom full of children who wanted to distract her and had developed patience as a professional skill. Tonight, he said. He got up and went to the back room. She heard him moving things, the scrape of something being pulled from a shelf, and then he came back with a battered tin box, the color of old rust, the kind that had been handled so many times the paint had worn through in the shape of hands. He set it on the table and looked at it the way he'd looked at the syndicate's letter on the first day, like he needed a moment before opening it. Margaret kept our papers, he said. She was better at that kind of thing. Lenora didn't say anything. She waited. He opened the box. Inside was the accumulated paperwork of a farm and a marriage and a life. There were receipts going back to 1882. A deed. A folded certificate, she could tell, from 3 feet away was a marriage record. Nellie's birth record. Letters she didn't look at. An old ledger. And underneath all of it, folded in a piece of waxed cloth that Margaret Redfern had apparently put there specifically to protect it from moisture, was a document that Lenora recognized as a territorial water claim by its header before she'd read the first line. She reached across the table. He nodded. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was good quality. Someone at the land office in 1884 had known their business, and it had held up. She read through it slowly. Silas watched her face. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table beside the syndicate's letter, smoothed it with both, and was quiet for almost a full minute. Silas waited. He had learned, in the past 2 weeks, that when Lenora went quiet and still, it meant she was assembling something in her head, and interrupting that process was like bumping a carpenter's elbow mid-measurement. Finally, she said, the filing date on this claim is March 14, 1884. That sounds right. She pointed to a line in the syndicate's letter. They mention prior survey agreements with the original land office. They don't give a date. She looked up. If the claim predates yours, they might have a case. If yours predates theirs, or if there are no prior survey agreements at all, and they're inventing that phrase, then they have nothing. Silas leaned forward. How do you tell which it is? You'd need to look at the county records, the actual land office filings. She paused. Do you know where those are kept? Clearwater, county seat. That's where the bank is too. Yes. She looked at the 2 documents side by side for another moment. Then she said, there's something else. These survey markers. She pointed to a section of the water claim that Silas had never read particularly closely, because it was the kind of technical language that made his eyes slide sideways. The northeastern boundary coordinates here, do you know if they still match the current fence lines? He thought about it. I reset the northeastern corner fence post 2 winters ago. Moved it maybe 4 feet north because the original post had rotted. Her expression didn't change exactly, but something sharpened behind it. 4 feet north. The post was rotted through. I put it where it would hold. But did you check the survey line before you moved it? He was quiet. The answer was no. He had moved a fence post in the middle of winter because the post was rotted and he needed it to hold, and he had not consulted a 7-year-old document in a tin box before doing it. I didn't check, he said. It probably doesn't matter, she said, and she said it immediately, which told him she'd already worked out why. The water claim is based on the creek itself, not the fence line. They might try to argue it. She picked up the water claim and turned it over. I want to copy these survey numbers. She went and got her own small writing journal. She kept it in the pocket of her apron and wrote down every reference number and coordinate in the water claim in her precise, even handwriting. She wrote the filing date twice, underlined it both times. Then she sat back and looked at what she'd written. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked. "I'm thinking they chose you because they thought you wouldn't look," she said. The directness of it hit him somewhere that made him feel two things at once, grateful and ashamed. Grateful because she'd said it plainly, rather than letting it sit unsaid between them. Ashamed because she was right. A man alone with a mortgage and a child, she continued. And her voice had no judgment in it, only the cool clarity of someone laying out facts. Backed by their own bank. Who's going to fight that? Nobody, he said. That's what they counted on. She closed her journal. Have there been other farms? Other families they've approached? He thought about it. Cobb Darnell had mentioned something 3 months ago, a family named Pruitt over the ridge, sold their water access rights for what Cobb described as almost nothing. Silas had thought at the time it was just a bad deal. He said as much to Lenora now. The Pruitts, she said. Did they have a lawyer? I don't think so. Elmer Pruitt's he's not a man who would think to get one. Did they have the original deed? Silas looked at her. I don't know. She made a small sound, not quite a sigh, not quite something harder. These things go the same way, she said. Someone sends a frightening letter. Family panics. They don't check the paperwork because they don't know they should. They give up what they own because they believe the company already owns it. She folded her journal closed. They're not buying water rights. They're buying people's fear of lawyers. He sat back in his chair. Outside, the wind had picked up against the north wall, and the house warmer now than it had been. When she arrived, held it out. So what to, he said. She looked at him. What do you want to do? I want to tell them to go to hell. That's a feeling, she said. I'm asking what you want to do. He looked at the tin box. At the water claim in her handwriting, copied into a small journal she kept in her apron pocket. At his own hands on the table, cracked from the cold and rough, from 3 years of doing everything alone. I want to keep my water, he said. I want to keep this farm. I want Nellie to grow up on this land. Then we need to know whether their claim is real or invented, Lenora said. And the only way to know that is to look at the county records. The county records are in Clearwater. He paused. Where my bank is. I know. Another silence. Not uncomfortable. Working. Could you go? He asked. It came out more carefully than he intended, like he was aware of asking something beyond what her position here required. She looked at him steadily. You're asking me to go to the county seat and look through land office records. You'd know what to look for better than I would, probably, she said, which was not agreement or refusal, just accuracy. I need to be here, he said. If I leave for 2 days, the animals don't get fed, and the pipes freeze. She picked up the syndicate's letter, looked at it one more time, put it down. I'll go Thursday, she said. Nellie can come. She's old enough for the trip, and it would do her good to see the county seat. She paused. And I'd rather have her with me than leave her here while you're working. He nodded slowly. The stage to Clearwater leaves from Cartwell Crossing at 6 in the morning. Cold at 6 in the morning. I'm aware of what cold feels like, she said dryly. Corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but it was something. They went on Thursday. Silas drove them to the stage, stopped before first light. Nellie bundled into her repaired coat beside Lenora on the wagon seat. Both of them quiet in the way that early mornings demand. He helped them down at the stage stop and stood for a moment in the dark with the stage lamp, throwing yellow light across the frozen mud. The filing reference number, Lenora said. If the county clerk gives you trouble, that number is your opener. She handed him a folded slip of paper from her journal. And don't let them tell you the records aren't public. They are. He took the paper, looked at it, looked at her. I thought you were going. I am going. That's in case something happens and I need you to go instead. She adjusted Nellie's hat. We'll be back by evening. He stood there after the stage pulled out, and it occurred to him, standing alone in the cold dark, with that slip of paper in his hand, that he hadn't been worried. Not really. Which was strange, because the situation was the same situation it had been a week ago, when he'd been lying awake at 2 in the morning, unable to outrun it. The same farm, the same debt, the same letter, the same threat. But something had shifted. He put the paper in his coat pocket and went home and fed the animals. The county clerk's office in Clearwater smelled like old paper and wood smoke, and the specific staleness of a room where the windows hadn't been opened since September. The clerk was a man in his 50s with the expression of someone who had decided long ago that most requests were inconveniences, and he looked at Lenora and Nellie over the top of his spectacles with the resignation of a man who had already had a long day, even though it was 10 in the morning. Original land filings, Lenora said. Territorial water claims in the Cartwell Crossing District, 1,882 through 1,886. He looked at her. That's the historical record. Yes. Those aren't documents for general browsing, miss. Mrs. Whitcomb, she said, which was not accurate, but was practical. And I understand they're not for browsing. I'm looking for a specific claim associated with the Redfern property on the Cartwell Creek, filed March 1884. And any prior claims the North Fork Development Syndicate may have registered for the same water source in that period. The clerk's expression shifted slightly. Not alarm exactly. More like a kind of cautious recalibration. The syndicate, he said. Yes. He looked at Nellie, who was standing quietly next to Lenora, her hands folded in front of her, looking at everything in the office, with the thorough attention she brought to anything new. Your daughter, he asked. My employer's daughter, Lenora said. She's very well behaved. You won't notice she's here. Nellie, to her credit, nodded at the clerk, with an expression of complete 7-year-old solemnity. Something happened in the clerk's face, a softening so small you might have missed it if you weren't watching. He went and got the files. It took 2 hours. Sat at a narrow table with the land office records spread carefully before her, and worked through them with the methodical focus she'd once applied to grading a classroom of 40 students' arithmetic systematically, without rushing, noting discrepancies rather than jumping to conclusions. Nellie sat beside her and was, as promised, unobtrusive. She looked at the documents Lenora pointed out to her, asked 2 quiet questions about what the survey symbols meant, and otherwise kept still. At the end of 2 hours, Lenora had 7 pages of notes in her small journal and a clarity that felt, in her chest, like cold water on a hot day, sharp and bracing, and absolutely real. The North Fork Development Syndicate had filed no water claim for the Cartwell Creek in the period from 1882 to 1886. They had filed a general land survey on a neighboring property, different boundaries in 1885, and someone had written across the survey map a notation about potential water source access, subject to review. That notation was in pencil. It was not a legal filing. It was not a claim. It was someone's note to themselves about something they intended to pursue and then apparently did not pursue, or had pursued through intimidation rather than through actual legal process. The Redfern water claim, filed March 14, 1884, was clean and complete. The filing number matched. The survey markers matched the original creek course. There was no competing claim of record. She sat there for a moment with her notes in front of her, making sure she was reading what she was reading and not what she wanted to be reading. Then she looked at Nellie and said, "We're done." Nellie looked up from a small diagram she'd been copying in the margin of a piece of scrap paper the clerk had given her. "Did you find what you needed?" "Yes." "Is it good or bad?" Lenora considered the honest answer for a 7-year-old. "It's good," she said, "for your father." Nellie nodded once with satisfaction, as though this had been the only acceptable outcome, and she was pleased the paperwork had agreed. On the stage home with Nellie asleep against her shoulder, Lenora read through her notes a second time. She was not a lawyer. She had never claimed to be one. But she had spent 9 years teaching young people to read documents with their eyes open rather than their wishes. And she knew the difference between a claim that existed and a claim that had been invented to frighten someone into surrendering. The syndicate had a pencil notation. Silas had a filed deed and a dated water claim with a filing number that had sat untouched and uncontested in the county record for 7 years. She also knew, reading between her own notes, something more uncomfortable. Clerk had known the syndicate's name. The very slight pause before he'd gone to get the files told her this was not the first time someone had come looking for information about them, and he had gotten the files anyway, which meant Either he was genuinely committed to the public record, or he had his own opinions about what the syndicate was doing that he wasn't in a position to state out loud. Either way, she had what she needed. The question now was what to do with it. Silas's first instinct, she already knew, would be to go to Clearwater and confront Bramwell Vane directly. He would want to stand in front of the man and tell him what she'd found, and demand an explanation. She knew this about him not from a long acquaintance, but from 20 days of watching how he operated. He was a man who processed things internally and then responded directly, which was usually his strength, and occasionally not. Confronting Bramwell Vane directly would be a mistake. Not because Silas was wrong to be angry. He was right to be angry. What the syndicate had done to the Pruitts, what they'd attempted to do to him, was a particular kind of theft that never showed up in a court record because it never reached a court. It happened in the gap between an intimidating letter and a frightened man's signature. But confronting Bramwell gave Bramwell something to fight. It gave him the chance to argue, to introduce doubts, to produce his pencil notation, and talk about it like it was something. It gave him a conversation, and a man like Bramwell Vane was very, very good at conversations. What he wasn't good at, what no bully was particularly good at, was silence that had already decided. She thought about this all the way home. Silas was on the porch when the wagon from the stage stop came up the road in the late afternoon. He'd been watching the road for an hour, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He came down the porch steps, and Nellie scrambled out and ran to him before the wagon had fully stopped. Because at 7 years old, you can run and talk at the same time with no loss of coherence. But, Papa, we went to a very big building and there were so many papers and Lenora read all of them. And I copied a survey diagram and the man at the desk gave me a piece of paper and I was very well behaved, I heard he said. Looking over her head at Lenora, most of its windows were dark, who had climbed down from the wagon with her satchel and was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Inside she said, "Nellie, are you hungry?" said Nellie. "Then let's fix that first." It was after supper, after Nellie was in bed, that Lenora opened her journal on the kitchen table and walked him through what she'd found. She did it the same way. She did everything methodically. No drama, just the shape of the thing laid out plainly. The syndicate's filing, what it actually said, versus what the letter implied it said. The Redfern water claim, clean and complete, and 7 years uncontested. The pencil notation that was not a legal claim and never had been. Silas listened without interrupting. His jaw tightened once, when she told him about the Pruitt implication, that this had likely been done before, to others, successfully. Speak. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "So they have nothing," he said. "They have a pencil notation on a neighboring property survey, and a very, very well-written letter," she said. He looked at the table. "I want to go to Clearwater and find Bramwell Vane." "I know. He did this to the Pruitts, probably." "Yes. He was going to do it to me and Nellie." "Yes." She paused. "And he'll do it to the next family after you, if someone doesn't stop him. But going to Clearwater and confronting him isn't how you stop him." He looked up. "Then how?" She put her journal on the table, open to the page with the filing numbers. "You write back," she said. "One letter short. You cite the filing date, the claim number, the survey markers. You state that you have examined the county records and found no prior legal claim on the water source in question. State that you intend to continue using your water according to your filed rights. And you say nothing else," he frowned. "Nothing else. No threats, no anger, no offer to negotiate or compromise. No apologies. Nothing that gives him room to argue, because you can't argue with a fact, but you can argue with an emotion." She looked at him steadily, expected fear. Give him certainty instead. The silence stretched out. He picked up the journal, looked at the filing numbers she'd written down, set it back. "Think he'll drop it?" "I think a man who built his strategy on other people's fear has very limited tools when the fear doesn't arrive." She folded her hands on the table. "He has lawyers and money and a bank connection, and he has been using those things to make people surrender before anyone checks the paperwork. The moment someone checks the paperwork and writes back, calmly, he has nothing." Silas looked at her. In the low lamplight, the kitchen had gone warm and still, and he was aware again of the gap under the door that was gone now, and the pantry that was organized in a way that made sense, and Nellie's coat hanging on the hook by the door with no torn sleeve, and all the invisible work of the past 20 days that had made this house feel like somewhere a person could think clearly. "Would you write it?" he said. She met his eyes. "It needs to come from you." "I know. He stopped. Started again. "Would you write the first draft? And then I'll write it in my hand." She was quiet for a moment. He thought she was going to say no. He thought she was going to tell him he needed to own the words from the beginning. But she said, "Get me a clean sheet of paper." He got it. She wrote for 15 minutes. He sat across from her and watched her write, watched her stop twice and scratch out a sentence and rewrite it, watched her hold the page up once and look at it at arm's length, and then make one more change near the end. She put it on the table in front of him. He read it. It was the most precise and restrained thing he'd ever read. It said exactly what she'd described: filing date, claim number, survey markers, county record verification, in language so clean and direct and confident it made the syndicate's letter look like what it was: dressed up guesswork in a fancy suit. There were no threats, no anger, no please or sorry or perhaps or we would like to discuss. Just, here is what exists. Here is what I have confirmed. Here is what I will continue to do. He read it twice. "Sign it," she said. "You sure?" "No," she said. "But I think it's right." He reached for the pen. He wrote his name at the bottom, Silas J. Redfern, in the particular handwriting of a man who'd learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse, just never tried to make it elegant, only legible. He set the pen down. They both looked at the letter. "Now we wait," she said. He nodded. Outside, the wind had come back around to the north, the same as it always did. But the house held against it, same as it had every night since she'd sealed the door, and Silas sat at his own kitchen table with his name at the bottom of a letter that told a powerful company exactly where they stood, and he thought, "I didn't know this was possible 3 weeks ago." He didn't say that out loud, but he thought it. Lenora closed her journal and stood up. She took her candle from the table. "Good night, Misters Redfern," she said. "Good night, Miss Whitcomb," he said. She went down the hall to her room. He sat alone for another few minutes, with the letter in front of him and the lamp burning low and the sound of the farm settling into cold around him. Then he folded the letter and put it in the envelope and sealed it. In the morning, he would take it to the post office in Cartwell Crossing. After that, it was out of his hands. He wasn't sure he minded that. He wasn't sure, actually, when the last time was, he genuinely trusted someone else to have thought through a problem better than he had. He thought maybe it had been Margaret. He thought maybe that was all right. He blew out the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time in weeks, he slept without lying awake at 2 in the morning first. The letter went out on a Friday morning. Silas drove to Cartwell Crossing before the post office opened and waited on the step in the cold with the envelope in his coat pocket, which he checked twice to make sure it was still there, even though there was nowhere else it could have gone. The postmaster, a thin man named Greer, who had been running the Cartwell Crossing post office since before Idaho was a state, took the envelope and weighed it and told Silas the postage and did not comment on the North Fork Development Syndicate address in Clearwater, though Silas was fairly certain Greer read every return address that came through his hands as a professional habit. He drove home. He did not tell Lenora what time he'd gone. She already knew he'd gone early because his coffee cup was cold when she came into the kitchen, and she poured it out and made fresh without saying anything about it. He came in from unhitching the horse and found the fresh cup on the table and sat down and drank it, and they did not discuss the letter. They would not discuss the letter again for 11 days. That was how long it took for the silence to begin. Not a response, not a counter letter, not a legal notice, not a threat, not a messenger from Clearwater with anything official. Just silence, which was its own kind of answer, though Silas did not recognize it as one for the first several days, because silence from a company like the North Fork Development Syndicate felt less like retreat and more like the stillness before something worse arrived. He checked the post in Cartwell Crossing on day 3. Nothing. Day 6, nothing. Day 8, Cobb Darnell came by to look at a horse he was considering buying from Silas, a gray mare that Silas had decided he could part with if the price was fair, and stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets and said, with the particular casualness of a man who had been building toward a question for the whole ride, "Over. Heard anything back from that syndicate business?" Silas looked at him. "How do you know about the syndicate business?" Cobb looked at the horse. Cartwell Crossing is not a large town, Redfern. This was true. Silas had not told anyone. He had not told Cobb, had not mentioned it at the feed store, had not raised it with Reverend Hatch at the church he occasionally attended, mostly for Nellie's sake. But a letter addressed to the North Fork Development Syndicate, sent from the Cartwell Crossing post office, mailed by a man whose farm everyone in the valley knew was carrying debt, that kind of thing moved through a small community the way water moves through dry ground. Quietly and everywhere. I sent them a letter, Silas said. What kind of letter? The kind that tells them what they own and what they don't. Cobb was quiet for a moment. He had a way of going quiet that was different from Lenora's quiet, where hers was assembling. His was deciding whether to say the thing he was already thinking. That woman wrote it, he said finally. It wasn't a question. Silas didn't answer immediately. She helped me understand the county records. Redfern. She helped me understand the county records, Silas said again, with the specific patience of a man who has decided what he's going to say and is prepared to keep saying it. Cobb looked at the mayor. The mayor looked back with the serene indifference of a horse who had no stake in human arguments. The Pruitt family, Cobb said. Elmer told me last spring he got a letter like that, signed over the water access for $60. $60, Silas. That creek is worth $60 a year, I know. He didn't know to look at his deed. I know that too. Cobb turned and looked at him. There was something in his face that was not quite an apology. Cobb Darnell was not a man who found apologies comfortable, but was in the neighborhood of one. I said she was trouble, he said. You said she was difficult. Same thing, I thought. Turns out there's a difference, Silas said. Cobb bought the mare. He paid a fair price, maybe a little more than fair, which was Cobb's version of acknowledging he'd been wrong about something without actually saying so. They shook hands and Cobb rode out, and Silas stood in the yard and watched him go and thought about the Pruitts' $60 and their $60 and their creek that was worth $60 a year, and he felt something cold and specific that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was the feeling of understanding, too late for them, that it could have been him. It nearly was him. He went inside. Lenora, for her part, had not been idle during the 11 days of waiting. This was something Silas was learning about her, in the way you learn things about a person you live alongside, not from what they tell you about themselves, but from watching how they fill time. Lenora did not wait passively. She was not the kind of person who could hold a problem in suspension and simply endure the suspension. She kept moving, but she moved in a particular direction toward whatever the next thing was that needed doing, which meant that while Silas checked the post and watched the road and woke at 2 a.m, parsing the silence for omens, Lenora had reorganized the household accounts. This was, for Silas, a revelation of a particular and uncomfortable kind. He had kept accounts the way he kept everything, since Margaret died functionally, minimally, just enough to know roughly where he stood. He knew the total mortgage amount. He knew, in a general way, what he spent at the feed store each month, and what came in from selling livestock and what he owed the bank on the quarterly schedule. Beyond that, the numbers had a tendency to blur into a general sense of not quite enough that he'd been living with for 3 years. Lenora had apparently found his account ledger on a shelf in the back room and spent 3 evenings going through it. She had not asked his permission. This would bother him, he thought. When she showed him what she'd done, it would bother him that she'd done it without asking. It bothered him for about 4 minutes. Then she showed him the numbers. She had laid out the actual cash flow of the farm month by month for the past year. Income, livestock sales. The small amount from the vegetable surplus she'd already identified could be increased against outgoing expenses, which she had separated into categories he had never separated: feed, hardware, food stores, mortgage, incidentals. She had found in the incidentals column 3 areas where he'd been paying more than he needed to. The feed store in Cartwell Crossing was charging him 8 cents a bushel, more than the mill in Pemberton, 12 further but accessible, twice a month when he made other supply runs. He'd been paying for the additional convenience without knowing he was paying for it, because he'd never sat down and compared the numbers. She had also found, buried in the ledger from 18 months ago, a payment he'd made to a man named Ashcraft for fence materials that had never actually been delivered. $42. He didn't deliver the materials? Silas said. He was looking at the ledger entry, trying to remember. Ashcraft had been a trader who'd come through in the summer of 1890, sold a dozen farmers' materials at good prices, collected payment, and apparently not come back to everyone. Did you ever follow up on it? Lenora asked. He stopped. Margaret had died the autumn before that. The summer of 1890 had been a hard blur. No, he said. The man might be gone, she said. He might not. But even if the money is gone, you should know you're short. $42, you shouldn't be short. He looked at the ledger, and then at her summary sheet beside it. She'd done the summary in 2 columns, what the farm had actually spent, and what it should have spent if the accounts had been tighter. The gap between the 2 columns over 12 months was just over $90. He sat down. I wasn't being careful, he said. You were doing it alone, she said, and you were grieving. And you were keeping the child alive and a farm running. The accounts were the thing that could slip, so they slipped. She set her pen down. They don't need it to keep slipping. He looked at the summary. He thought about the mortgage. He thought about what $90 a year would mean against the $430 of debt. This is he started. He didn't have an immediate word for what it was. I didn't know I was this far from knowing, he said finally. Lenora looked at him with the expression she got when something he said was either confusing or more honest than she'd expected. After a moment, she said, most people don't know how far they are from knowing their own numbers. That's not ignorance. It's just what happens when you're underwater and you're not a bookkeeper. You're not a bookkeeper either, he said. No. But I kept the school's accounts for the last 4 years I taught there because the actual bookkeeper kept making errors that cost the district money. She paused. The board didn't thank me for it. They found it, what did they call it, presumptuous. He looked at her. A woman keeping accounts. A woman doing it better than the man they were paying to do it. She picked up her pen again and made a small notation at the bottom of the summary sheet. Here's what I'd suggest for the next quarter. You don't have to take any of it. She handed him a second sheet. He read through it. It was practical and specific, and not a single thing on it required money he didn't have. It was all just reorganization of money he was already spending. He thought, this is what she does. Not big gestures, not dramatic rescues. She just walks through a house or a set of accounts or a county record office, and she finds what's wrong, and she says so, and she offers the fix, and she waits for you to decide. He'd hired her to cook and sew and keep the house. He was starting to understand that was not what he'd gotten. On the 11th day, a second letter arrived from the North Fork Development Syndicate. It was shorter than the first one, much shorter, half a page, where the first had been nearly 2 full pages of dense official language. Silas found it in the post when he went to Cartwell Crossing for feed. He read it standing outside the post office in the cold because he couldn't make himself wait until he was home. It said, in the careful non-language of a company choosing its words with great precision, that upon further review of the relevant territorial filings, it had been determined that the Redfern water claim predated any survey interests the syndicate had identified in the area. They thanked Mr. Redfern for his attention to the matter and wished him well in his continued operation of the property. That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd attempted, no mention of the Pruitts or anyone else. Just upon further review, never mind. Silas read twice. He folded it. He put it in his coat pocket next to the gloves Lenora had mended, and he stood outside in the Cartwell Crossing cold for a long minute, and he was not sure what he felt. He'd expected relief. He felt something closer to a flat, clear anger, not hot, just present, because he understood now what upon further review meant. It meant, we checked, and you actually looked at the paperwork, so we can't take this one. It meant, we'll find someone else. It meant the Pruitts' $60 was still spent, and that family's water access was still gone, and the syndicate was whole and unhurt, and would be doing this again to someone who didn't have a woman in their house, who recognized intimidation dressed up in courtesy. He loaded the feed. He drove home. He came into the kitchen where Lenora was going through the weekly supply inventory. She did this every Thursday. Now, it had become one of the household rhythms he'd stopped noticing because it had simply become part of how things worked, and he put the letter on the table in front of her without saying anything. She picked it up, read it, set it down. There was a silence. Well, she said. Well, he said. She looked at the letter for another moment. He watched her face and saw something move through it that he couldn't fully name, not satisfaction exactly, because satisfaction implied surprise, and he didn't think she'd been surprised. More like the particular feeling of a calculation that had been correct, which was its own thing, quieter than triumph. They'll do it to someone else, he said. I know. There's nothing I can do about that. She looked up. There's one thing, she said. You could talk to the families you know who've had similar letters. Tell them what you found in the county records. Tell them to look at their deeds. She paused. The Pruitts can't get their money back. But if someone else gets that letter next month and already knows to check the filing date, they'll know because I told them. Because you and I found it, she said. There was a slight emphasis on the "and" that was not pride, exactly more like the precision of someone who corrects inaccuracies on principle. He looked at her. She was already turning back to the inventory, pen moving down the column. Like the letter from the syndicate was already behind her. He picked it up and folded it and put it in the tin box with the water claim and the rest of the papers. He put it next to Margaret's marriage certificate and Nellie's birth record, which was strange company for a corporate retreat. But it was where things like that belonged with the other documents that told the story of what this land actually was. Nellie found out on a Saturday. She found out the way children find out things in small houses, not because anyone told her, but because she was paying attention. And adults frequently underestimate how much a quiet child pays attention. She had been reading at the kitchen table while Silas and Lenora talked in the doorway of the back room, and she had been reading in the particular way she sometimes read, which was with one eye on the page and one ear on the room. She heard her father say the syndicate withdrew, and she heard Lenora say, I know. And she heard the silence after that, which had a different quality than their usual silences. That evening, when Lenora came to check on her reading progress, she did this every night, sitting beside Nellie and listening to her read a passage aloud, and asking her 2 or 3 questions about it, not quiz questions, but thinking questions, the kind that didn't have one right answer. Nellie looked up from the reader and said, Is our farm safe now? Lenora looked at her. She had the expression she got when Nellie said something that required an actual answer rather than a reassurance. For now, she said, Yes. Was it the letter you helped Papa write? Your father wrote the letter, Lenora said, which was the same thing Silas had said to Cobb Darnell and which was true in the same way. Nellie considered this. She held her reader flat on the table with both palms, which was something she did when she was thinking through something. You knew what to look for, Nellie said. I had a guess, Lenora said. It turned out to be right. What if it had been wrong? Lenora's was quiet for a moment. Then we would have looked for the next thing to try. She paused. That's usually how it works. You don't always know the right answer first, but you don't stop looking for it either. Nellie seemed to consider this as a satisfactory answer. She opened her reader again. Then, without looking up from the page, she said, I'm glad you came here. Lenora was quiet. The lamp between them cast its small circle of light across the page, and Nellie's serious face, and the table where they did their lessons every morning, and Lenora sat with that sentence for a moment, the way you sit with something you weren't quite prepared for. Read me the next passage, she said finally, because she was a woman who had learned when not to fill a silence with words. Nellie read. December came in the way it does in Idaho, not all at once, but as a series of smaller arrivals, each colder than the last, until one morning you wake up, and the world is a different texture than it was, and you know there's no going back to what it was the week before. Farmhouse held against it. Better than last year, better than the year before that. The sealed gaps did their work. The reorganized woodpile went further than Silas had calculated because Lenora had been right about the storage method, which kept the wood drier and therefore hotter when it burned. The pantry lasted into December with more margin than he'd had in 3 years. He noticed all of this. He noticed it the way he might notice a fence line holding against a hard winter, not with surprise exactly, but with a specific gratitude that was mixed with something he couldn't immediately name. One morning in early December, he went out before first light to check on the livestock and came back inside to find Nellie already at the kitchen table with her slate, working through a set of arithmetic problems Lenora had assigned the night before. This was new. Nellie had not, before Lenora arrived, gotten up before she was called. She had not, before the morning lessons began, shown any particular eagerness for the arithmetic that was available to her. Now she was up in the cold kitchen before her father, working numbers in her own time. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. She hadn't noticed him. She was erasing something and rewriting it, the way Lenora had shown her don't just correct the answer, find where the error started. That one's right, he said. She looked up. I know. Checking it again. He came in and poured his coffee and sat across from her and looked at the slate. She showed him the problem. He worked through it in his head and confirmed it. Lenora says checking right answers is just as important as finding wrong ones, Nellie said. Because sometimes you get the right answer by accident with the wrong method, and then you don't know the method, you just got lucky. Silas looked at his daughter. That's he said. Yeah, that's right. Papa, Nellie said, in the tone she used when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a while. He'd learned that tone. What, is Lenora going to stay? He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. It was warm and the kitchen was cold, and there were several answers to that question, all of them true to different degrees. Her arrangement with the agency goes through spring, he said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her, 7 years old, and not remotely fooled by this distinction between what he'd said and what she'd asked. I don't know, he said, which was the honest answer and which he recognized, saying it out loud, was not quite true either. He did know, on some level he hadn't fully admitted to, that the idea of spring arriving and the household arrangement ending was something he didn't want to look at directly, the same way he hadn't wanted to look directly at the syndicate's letter. I asked her if she liked it here, Nellie said. His hands tightened slightly on the cup. When last week, when we were doing geography, what did she say? Nellie picked up her chalk and made a small mark on the slate that wasn't part of any problem. She said she liked it more than she expected to. He sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove working against the cold. Nellie, he said, don't push that. She looked at him with the expression she'd inherited from Margaret, the one that said she was politely reserving the right to disagree with him. I'm not pushing, she said. I'm just telling you what she said. She erased the small chalk mark. You push things, Papa, I just noticed. He drank his coffee and did not respond to this, which was itself a response. The thing Silas had not told anyone, not Cobb Darnell or Nellie or anyone in Cartwell Crossing, was that he'd ridden into town 2 weeks after, sending the letter to the syndicate and gone to see a man named Hollis, who ran the small land and title office above the hardware store. He hadn't told Lenora either. He'd gone to ask Hollis what would happen, practically and legally, if the syndicate ignored his letter and sent a lawyer instead. He needed to know the shape of a worst case. He needed to be able to see the edges of it. Hollis had known Silas for years, had handled the original purchase of the farm back in '83, and he sat behind his desk with the comfortable directness of a man who had given hard news to enough people that he no longer tried to decorate it. If they send a lawyer, Hollis said, you need one. Can't afford one. Then you need to hope they decide the cost of the litigation isn't worth it. Hollis picked up a pencil and turned it between his fingers. What's your claim position? Silas laid out what Lenora had found. The filing date, the survey numbers, the absence of any competing legal claim in the county record. Hollis listened. He asked 2 questions about the survey markers. Then he sat back and said, whoever looked that up for you did a solid job. She knew what to look for. Hollis raised an eyebrow. She my housekeeper. He said it flatly, without apology. Hollis looked at him for a moment. Your housekeeper went through the Clearwater County land records and found a clean title position. Yes. And wrote your response. I wrote my response, Silas said, with the same patience he'd deployed on Cobb Darnell. She helped me understand what to say. Hollis tapped the pencil on his desk twice. What's her background? Schoolteacher, Ohio. Educated. The agency warned me she was too educated, Silas said. Hollis laughed. It was a real laugh, not polite a laugh, that said he found something genuinely funny. He shook his head. Redfern. The syndicate picked the wrong farm. They didn't know that when they picked it. No, Hollis said. I expect they didn't. He set the pencil down. Here's my honest assessment. If your claim is as clean as you say, and from what you've described it sounds like it is a company, like the syndicate, is not going to spend lawyer money on a fight they can see they'll lose. They want the easy ones. The Pruitts. Families who don't look. He paused. You looked. She looked, Silas said, and this time didn't correct himself. Hollis gave him a long measuring look. You going to keep her? Silas looked at his hat in his hands. Her arrangement goes through spring. That's not what I asked. It occurred to Silas that everyone in his life had apparently decided to stop accepting his indirect answers on this particular subject. He put his hat on and stood up and thanked Hollis for his time. Hollis said, If they send a lawyer anyway, you come back to me. I'll see what I can do." Silas said he appreciated it and went back out into the cold. He drove home and did not tell Lenora about the visit. The same way he hadn't told her about the specific quality of fear he'd felt the first 6 days after mailing the letter. Some things he needed to carry for himself. He understood that this was a particular kind of stubbornness. Margaret had called it his keep it in the chest unlit breaks problem, but he also understood that not every feeling needed to be shared to be legitimate. He came home and she was teaching Nellie to identify different qualities of cloud formations, which she'd apparently decided was useful both as weather prediction and as geography. Nellie was at the window pointing at the sky with the focused intensity of a scientist. Lenora was standing beside her, saying that one and yes. And what does that usually mean? And what about the one at the edge? He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched this for a moment. Before they noticed him, he thought, this is what the house is supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not without its problems, but alive in a way it hadn't been alive in 3 years. He went to hang up his coat. The silence from the syndicate held through December. By Christmas, Silas had stopped waiting for it to break. Not because he'd convinced himself they were gone for good, but because he'd done what he could do, and the waiting had become a background condition, like the cold or the debt a real thing, but no longer the loudest thing in the room. Christmas on the Redfern farm had been, for 3 years, a thing Silas had managed out of obligation to Nellie. He'd done what was needed. A small tree from the ridge. A few small gifts he'd planned badly and bought too late. The feeling of a holiday that was being performed rather than felt, which both of them probably knew and neither mentioned. This year was different in ways he found hard to account for, because nothing specific had been announced about Christmas, and no particular preparations had been made until Lenora simply started. She asked Nellie what she'd liked about Christmases before, the question tactful and direct, not dancing around Margaret, but not making her the center of the conversation either. Nellie said the smell of the kitchen. Lenora made a note of that in the small journal she kept in her apron pocket, which was apparently where she kept everything. A week before Christmas, the kitchen smelled different. He didn't ask immediately. He came in and registered the difference something with dried fruit and stood there for a moment. "Cider's been on since morning," Lenora said, without looking up from what she was doing. "And I used some of the dried apples in a pudding. The apples were getting too close to the edge." The edge of what? Of being better to eat than to keep. She looked at him then. "Do you like apple pudding?" "I do," he said. "Good," she said. "Because that's what we're having." It was not a romantic gesture. He wanted to be clear with himself about that. It was practical resourcefulness. Use the apples before they turned. Make something good out of the using. Most of its windows, but the result was a kitchen that smelled like something he recognized as home, and a child who came in from her reading and stood in the kitchen doorway and breathed in with her eyes wide. "It smells like before," Nellie said. Lenora looked at her. Something careful moved through her expression. "Does that feel all right?" she asked. She didn't specify what before meant. She didn't need to. Nellie thought about it. She had the quality her father had of thinking through her own feelings before reporting them, which at 7 was unusual and perhaps a little sad. "Yes," she said finally. "I think it's okay for it to smell like before." Lenora nodded once. "Good," she said. "Wash your hands. You can help me with the next part." Nellie went to wash her hands with the purposefulness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this invitation. Silas leaned against the doorframe and watched them. He was aware of the debt in the back of his mind, and the syndicate's silence, which was not yet resolved enough to be trusted, and the winter ahead, and the 100 things still wrong with the farm and the accounts and the future. All of that was real. None of it had gone away. But standing in the doorway of his own kitchen, watching his daughter stand on a chair beside the woman who had walked in with one trunk and no illusions, and had spent 5 weeks quietly, making everything stronger, he felt the particular weight of a man who understands something. Large is happening, but has not yet found words for it. He pushed off the doorframe and went to help with the firewood. Outside, the snow was coming down in the steady, purposeful way that meant it was planning to stay, the kind of snow that covered the fields and the fence lines and the yard, and made the world look briefly like something that had been cleaned. He loaded the wood in the cold and carried it inside in 2 trips, stamping snow off his boots at the door, and when he came in, Nellie was explaining to Lenora, with great authority, the specific way the pudding should be stirred. Most of its windows were dark, which she had apparently decided she remembered from watching Margaret, and which Lenora was listening to with complete seriousness. "That's very specific," Lenora said. "Always to the left?" "Always to the left," Nellie said, with absolute confidence. "Take your word for it," Lenora said, and stirred to the left. Silas set down the wood and crouched to stack it by the stove. Kept his back to them so they wouldn't see his face. He was not a man who cried. He was not crying. His eyes were simply adjusting to the brightness of the kitchen after the gray outside. That's all it was. He stacked the wood and stood up and cleared his throat and said, "What time is supper?" And Lenora said 6, and Nellie said, "Papa, I'm in charge of the stirring," and he said, "I can see that," and that was all of it. That was the whole moment. Ordinary and unremarkable and absolutely everything. He picked up his coat again and went back out to check on the horses, because there was always something that needed doing, and because he needed the cold air and the simple company of animals who required only the basic things and asked no complicated questions about what was happening inside the house. Snow kept falling. Inside, Nellie stirred to the left. January came the way it always did in Idaho, without asking and without apology. The cold that had seemed serious in December turned out to have been only practicing. January meant business. The kind of cold that made the wood in the walls contract and crack at night, a sound like something breaking that you had to learn to sleep through. The kind of cold that froze the water in the bucket left too close to the door overnight, that made the horses' breath come out in clouds so thick they looked like small factories, that turned the mud of the yard into iron and made every morning errand take twice as long because your hands wouldn't cooperate. Silas had lived through 11 of these winters on this land. He knew its rhythms. He'd learned what to brace for and what to simply endure. What he hadn't known in any of those previous winters was what it felt like to come inside from the cold to a house that was actually managing itself. That was the thing he hadn't anticipated. Not warmth exactly, he'd always kept the house from freezing, but management. Kind of ongoing intelligence applied to a household that means the firewood is the right dryness and the right amount. That the food stores are being drawn down in the right order, so nothing goes bad before it's used. That the small emergencies of winter, a hinge freezing, a draft appearing from a new source, Nellie's chilblains on her left hand. From one morning she'd forgotten her glove were handled before they became larger emergencies. He'd been managing by reaction for 3 years. Lenora managed by anticipation, and the difference between those two approaches was the difference between always being behind and occasionally being ahead. He noticed it without saying anything, because saying it would have required articulating something he wasn't sure he had the right language for yet. It was bigger than she's useful, and more complicated than I'm grateful, and it lived in the part of his chest that he'd gotten very good at not examining directly since Margaret died. He noticed it, and he kept working, and the winter went on. The first week of January brought a different kind of problem, one that had nothing to do with the syndicate or the accounts or the cold. It came in the form of a woman named Mrs. Cecily Boone, who arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a buggy driven by her son-in-law, wrapped in a wool coat that cost more than most families in Cartwell Crossings spent on clothing in a year. Mrs. Boone was 63 years old and had been the closest thing Cartwell Crossing had to a social authority for 20 years. She had opinions about everything and the confidence to deliver them. She had been a friend of Margaret Redfern's, in the way that a woman of standing is sometimes a friend to a woman of lesser standing genuinely fond, but with an awareness of the distinction that never fully went away. She had heard about Lenora. Everyone in Cartwell Crossing had heard about Lenora by January. This was inevitable. A widowed rancher, a woman from Ohio with a college education, a child who'd apparently started reading at a level 2 years above her age, these things moved through a small community. Silas had expected the talk. He hadn't fully anticipated Mrs. Boone deciding to come and assess the situation in person. He was out checking the fence on the east side when the buggy came up the road, so it was Lenora who answered the door. She told him about it that evening, after Nellie was in bed, with a particular evenness of voice she used when she was describing something that had required her to be careful. Mrs. Boone had come in and looked at the house. Lenora had given her tea. Mrs. Boone had asked about her background, her education, her previous positions, Lenora had answered accurately and without elaboration. Then Mrs. Boone had said, "I want to speak plainly, Miss Whitcomb." "Please do," Lenora had said. "A man in Mr. Redfern's position, a widower, indebted, raising a young child is in a vulnerable position. Not just financially. People talk." About what specifically? Lenora had asked, with the precision that had apparently been the thing Mrs. Boone was deciding whether she liked. About a woman living in his house. An unmarried woman. A hired woman, Lenora had said. In a formal domestic arrangement through a licensed agency. Yes. But people draw their own conclusions. What conclusions would you like them to draw instead? Lenora had asked. Mrs. Boone had been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, "I'd like them to draw the conclusion that Mr. Redfern is a respectable man who has made a respectable arrangement for his household." Then I think Lenora had said, "We want the same thing." There had been another silence, and then Mrs. Boone had asked about Nellie's lessons, and they had talked about Nellie's lessons for 20 minutes, and at the end of it, Mrs. Boone had said Lenora's approach sounded sensible and finished her tea and gone. Silas listened to all of this. He was sitting at the kitchen table. He waited until Lenora was done. "She was warning you," he said. "She was assessing me," Lenora said. "The warning was part of the assessment." "What does that mean?" Lenora folded her hands on the table. "It means she wanted to know whether I understood the position I was in and whether I was handling it carefully. She's a woman who thinks about how things look because she spent 60 years in a community where how things look matters to women more than it matters to men." She paused. "She wasn't unkind about it. But she came to check on you." "She came to check on you," Lenora said. "On whether your household was being managed appropriately." She cared about Margaret. He absorbed this. What did she think? At the end, "I think she decided I was probably all right," Lenora said. There was the faintest dryness in her voice. High praise. He looked at her across the table. She was looking at her folded hands, and there was something in her posture that was very slightly different from her usual posture, not defeated, nothing that obvious, but tighter. Like she'd been holding herself carefully for 2 hours and hadn't fully released it yet. "Does it bother you?" he said. "People talking." She looked up. "Does it bother you?" I asked first. She considered this for a moment with the expression that meant she was deciding how honest to be. "I've had people talk about me since I was 22 years old and started having opinions in a schoolroom," she said. "I've learned to ask whether the talking changes anything real. If it doesn't change anything real, I try not to spend too much energy on it." "Does it change anything real here?" "Not yet," she said. "It might eventually if it reaches the agency." She paused. "My arrangement here is through the agency. If they receive complaints about the appropriateness of the arrangement, they have grounds to recall me." He stared at her. "They can do that? They placed me. They have responsibility for my conduct." She said it without bitterness. "It's a reasonable arrangement. It just means appearances matter somewhat, whether I like it or not." Silas looked at the table. He thought about Mrs. Boone and her expensive coat and her 20 years of being Cartwell Crossing's social weather. He thought about how quickly something could be taken from you if the right person decided to take it, and he was aware of a specific anger that was different from the anger he'd felt about the syndicate. This was smaller and more personal and therefore in some ways worse. She seemed satisfied when she left. Lenora said, "I think we're all right for now." He nodded slowly. "I'll talk to Cobb." "About what?" "Cobb talks to everyone. If I tell him the arrangement is appropriate and above board and well managed, he'll say so to anyone who says otherwise. He's not subtle, but he's loud." Something shifted in Lenora's expression. "You do that?" "It's practical," he said, "and it's true." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than that. "You?" she said finally. "It's practical," he said again, and he heard himself say it twice and understood that the second time he said it, he was probably not being entirely honest about his reasons. He got up and went to check the stove. He talked to Cobb the next day. He didn't make a speech of it. He said simply that the household arrangement was formal and appropriate, and that Lenora Whitcomb was a capable woman doing a necessary job, and that anyone suggesting otherwise was wrong. Cobb listened, nodded, said, "I figured." And that was the end of it, because Cobb Darnell was, as Silas had said, loud, And by the end of the following week, the particular flavor of speculation that had been circulating about the Redfern farm had shifted into something more like admiration. Because Cobb had also mentioned, apparently at some length, what Lenora had found in the county records and what it had meant for the water rights. A capable woman who'd outmaneuvered the North Fork Development Syndicate played better in Cartwell Crossing than almost any other story you could tell. Silas found this out from Greer at the post office, who told him with some satisfaction that the general consensus was he'd made a smart hire. He wasn't sure how he felt about the community's approval of a decision he'd made for his own reasons, but he decided it was better than the alternative. It was the coat that broke something open. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't been building toward it or waiting for the right moment. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of January, when he came inside from the barn and found Lenora standing at the kitchen table with Nellie's winter coat spread flat in front of her, making a final repair to the hem that had started coming loose. He'd seen her repair that coat once before the sleeve, back in November. The mend that had been invisible, the moment that had made Nellie turn in a slow circle and say it doesn't have the cold spot anymore. That repair had mattered to him in a way he'd filed carefully in the part of himself he didn't examine. But watching her now, in January light, with the coat flat on the table and her hands moving with the quiet competence of someone who has done this 10,000 times, he thought about the morning in October when he'd tried to repair that sleeve himself and made it worse. He thought about standing in the doorway watching the rip get larger every week. He thought about the specific helplessness of knowing you're something simple and being unable to provide it. He thought about Margaret, who would have fixed it in an afternoon and never mentioned it. He thought, I've been failing her in small ways for 3 years, and I stopped being able to see the small ways because there were too many of them. Lenora looked up and saw him standing there. The hem was going, she said. I've tacked it for now. It needs a proper fix this weekend, when I have better light. He didn't say anything immediately. He was doing the thing he did, carrying the feeling around the room to see where it landed, before he said anything about it. That coat, he said. She waited. I tried to fix the sleeve in October, he said. Before you came. I know, she said. I could see the original stitching under mine. He looked at the coat. Margaret would have he started and stopped. He never talked about Margaret in present tense, not even in the conditional. He'd trained himself out of it, or tried to, because it had a way of collapsing time in a direction he couldn't afford. I know, Lenora said again. Her voice was not soft exactly, but it was careful. I'm not, he said. He stopped again. He was standing in the middle of his own kitchen, failing to complete sentences, which was not characteristic of him. He was a man who said what he meant, or kept quiet. He didn't usually flounder in the middle. You don't have to explain it, she said. I want to, he said. I just don't have. I'm working out how to say it. She set her needle down. She put both hands flat on the table beside the coat and waited. That patience again, the classroom patience, the kind that doesn't press. When I hired you, he said carefully, I thought I needed someone who could manage the house. Practical things. Cooking, sewing, keeping Nellie from running completely wild. She wasn't running wild. She was running careful, he said, which is its own kind of problem. Lenora looked at him. He thought she understood what he meant, that a child who makes herself small so she won't be a burden is a child who has already absorbed something she shouldn't have had to absorb. Point is, he said, I thought I knew what I needed. I had a list. Practical things. He paused. It turned out I was wrong about the list. She was very still. The stove ticked. Outside wind moved across the eaves, and the house held it out, the way it held out everything now, sealed against what wanted in. What do you mean? She said. Her voice was level. She wasn't going to fill in what he was trying to say. She never did. I mean, the list was too short, he said. He looked at the coat on the table. I didn't know how short until you got here. A silence. Not a bad one. The agency is going to write, she said. She said it quietly, like she was helping him toward something. The end of the month. They ask after 6 weeks whether the arrangement should be continued. I know, he said. What will you tell them? He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the expression he'd come to know as her listening face open, but not waiting to be surprised. Most of its windows were dark, like she'd already been thinking about this and was ready for whatever he said and would deal with it the same way she dealt with everything. That depends on something, he said. On what? On what you'd want me to tell them. The silence stretched. He was aware of his own heartbeat, which was something he generally ignored as a matter of policy. She looked down at the coat, back up at him. Something moved through her face that he couldn't entirely read, which was unusual. He'd gotten fairly good at reading her. I don't know the answer to that quickly, she said. I'm not asking quickly, he said. I'm asking you to think about it. She nodded once. She picked up the coat and folded it carefully along its seams and set it on the chair beside the table. She picked up her needle and thread. I'll think about it, she said, and that was where they left it, which was both less and more than what he'd expected, and somewhere in the middle was something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of something real. He did not sleep particularly well that night. This was fair. He lay in the dark and went through the conversation 3 times, in the way you replay something looking for, where you said the wrong thing. He didn't think he'd said the wrong thing. He thought he'd said the closest thing to the true thing he could manage, which was not the same as the right thing, but was at least honest. He thought about what Cobb would say if he knew about this conversation. He thought about what Mrs. Boone would say. He thought about what Hollis at the land office had said you going to keep her, and how, at the time, he'd put his hat on and left rather than answer. He thought about Margaret, not with the grief that had been so close to the surface for 3 years, but with a different quality, the way you think about someone you loved and lost, when you are also starting to think about whether you are allowed to live forward, whether that constitutes something being taken from them or something added to you. He'd never sorted that out to his satisfaction. He'd been afraid to try, mostly. It was easier to stay in motion, keep the fence lines up, not look at the ceiling for too long. He looked at the ceiling. Then he thought about Nellie on the porch in November with bare feet in the cold, carrying the other boot because the lace had snapped, looking at a strange woman with those serious brown eyes. He thought about Nellie stirring to the left. He thought about Nellie at 5 in the morning with her slate, checking a right answer because you don't stop at right. You check how you got there. He fell asleep somewhere around that thought, which was the most restful version of 2 in the morning he'd had in 3 years. Lenora, for her part, was also awake. She was sitting at the small table in her room, with her journal open, not writing anything, which was unusual. She generally wrote something every night: observations, notes from Nellie's lessons, household accounts, sometimes a passage she'd been thinking about from a book she'd read years ago and still carried in her head. She used the journal the way other people used conversation. It was where she worked things out. Tonight, she wasn't working anything out. She was sitting with the pen in her hand and the journal open and thinking about Ohio, not with longing. She'd been clear with herself for a long time about Ohio. School had been good work, and she'd been good at it, and losing it had been a specific kind of injustice that she'd been angry about for years before she'd decided the anger wasn't useful and set it down. The H-8's been a practical next step. The 2 previous placements had been she looked for the honest words disappointing, in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The first family had wanted a servant who could recite credentials. The second had wanted her credentials precisely as long as they served, and then found them inconvenient. She'd left both without drama and without regret, but not without cost. There was a cost to starting over. There was a cost to carrying your one trunk and your satchel to another stage and another town and another household that might or might not be what it appeared. She was 31 years old, and she had, until 6 weeks ago, been reasonably certain about one thing, that she was unlikely to stay anywhere long enough to feel the leaving of it. She looked at her open journal. She thought about what Silas had said. The list was too short. She thought about Nellie, who had handed her a stub of pencil on the first night and who said, "I'm glad you came here," without looking up from her book. She thought about the county records office in Clearwater, the 2 hours at the narrow table, finding the clean title in the filing that the syndicate had gambled nobody would bother to find. She thought about the specific feeling of that, not triumph, not even satisfaction quite. More like, this is what a mind is for. This is what it feels like to use what you actually are. She hadn't felt that in either of the previous households. She wrote one line in the journal. Then she looked at it. She closed the journal. She went to bed. The agency letter arrived at the end of January, as Lenora had said it would. It was addressed to Silas. The arrangement was his. Legally, the agency's client was always the household, and it was a standard form letter with spaces filled in. asking whether the placement had been satisfactory and whether he wished to continue. He read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up. He was on his first cup of coffee, and it was still dark outside, and the stove was doing its early morning work. He thought about what he was going to write. Then Nellie came in, which was earlier than she usually appeared, and she was carrying her slate, and she looked at the letter on the table, and then at her father, and said, "Is that from the agency?" He looked at her. "How do you know about agency letters?" "Lenora mentioned it," she said. She sat down across from him. Not at her usual spot, at his spot, across from him. The spot where Lenora usually sat. What did she say about it? She said the agency writes at 6 weeks to see if things are working. Nellie set her slate flat on the table. Things working? He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, bare feet under the table because she always forgot her socks until her feet were cold. Hair not yet brushed, which Lenora was working on establishing as a morning habit with limited success. A smear of chalk on her left wrist from working problems the night before. "Things are working," he said. "Then you should tell them that." "I know. And you should ask if she can stay," Nellie said. With the absolute straightforwardness, the that-coordinateness of a child that have thought about something carefully and decided the adults are taking too long about it. He looked at her. "Nellie, I know," she said. "You want to be careful." But Papa, she stopped and looked at her slate, and then back at him with her mother's eyes and her own particular directness. "She fixed my coat the real way, not like you tried to fix it." He felt the corner of his mouth move before he could stop it. "That's not a great advertisement for me. You're good at other things," she said generously. "But she's good at that kind of thing. And she's good at the lesson things. And she found out about the water." She paused. "She's good at a lot of things. I know that. And she likes it here," Nellie said. "She doesn't talk about leaving." A pause. "The lady who came and watched the house last year didn't stay 3 weeks. Lenora's been here almost 2 months." He hadn't known Nellie had been keeping count. He felt something shift in his chest, the way ice shifts in spring quietly, with significant implication. "You've been watching," he said. "I always watch," Nellie said, with the matter-of-factness of a child who has learned, this is what careful people do. He looked at the agency letter. He thought about how to say what he wanted to say in the formal language of a household arrangement, and whether the formal language of a household arrangement was adequate to contain what he actually meant. He decided it probably wasn't, but it was where you started. He wrote, "The arrangement has been entirely satisfactory. Miss Whitcomb is capable, reliable, and has materially improved the management of this household in ways I did not anticipate when I engaged her services. I wish to continue the arrangement beyond the original term and would appreciate information on how to formalize that extension." He read it back. Nellie, who had been watching him write, said, "What did you say?" "I said she's doing good work, and I want her to stay." Nellie nodded. "That's right," she said, with the air of someone who had written the same letter in her head weeks ago and was satisfied to see the adults catching up. He sealed the letter. He would mail it on his next trip to Cartwell Crossing. He looked at his daughter across the table in the early morning dark, with her chalk-dusted wrist and her uncombed hair, sitting in the seat where Lenora usually sat as if she'd been making a point about it and didn't care if he noticed. "Nellie," he said. "What? You could have just asked me." She looked at him with patient, 7-year-old wisdom. "I did ask you. Twice. You kept saying the arrangement goes through spring." He had nothing to say to that. He got up and refilled his coffee. The evening after he mailed the agency letter, Silas found Lenora in the kitchen after supper, standing at the window in the particular posture she had when she was thinking about something she hadn't decided yet. He'd learned that posture. Hands at her sides, not doing anything, which was unusual for her because her hands were always doing something: mending, writing, cooking, adjusting, checking. When they were still, something else was working. "I wrote to the agency," he said. He put his coat on the hook and stood in the kitchen. Turned. "I know. Nellie told me." "Nellie," he said. "She said you wrote that the arrangement was satisfactory and you wanted to continue it." She looked at him with the steady gaze that never quite gave everything away. "Is that what you wrote?" "Essentially." "What's the non-essential part?" He looked at her. He thought about the conversation 3 weeks ago, the coat on the table, the too short list, the "I'll think about it" she'd given him. Thought up an outline in the dark, checking the ceiling and thinking about Margaret and about whether living forward was permitted. He'd decided it was. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want to ask it plainly, because I think you deserve that, and also because the last time I tried to be indirect about something important to me, it took 3 weeks. She waited. Still hands. When your term ends in the spring, he said, I would like you to consider not leaving. Pause. I'd like you to consider, he said carefully, whether you might want to stay something other than the household arrangement. Something permanent. He could hear himself getting tangled and made himself stop and start over. I'm asking you to consider marrying me. That's what I'm asking. The kitchen was very quiet. Lenora stood at the window with the snow-blue dark behind her, and she looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He didn't try to fill the silence. He'd learned from her when not to. That's a large question, she said finally. I know. We've known each other 2 months. I know that, too. I'm not. She stopped. She looked at her hands, which were still at her sides. I need to think about it properly. Not tonight. I'm not asking for tonight, he said. You're asking eventually. I'm asking eventually, he agreed. She looked at him with the expression that was neither yes nor no, but was the most honest face seen on another person, the face of someone who was actually considering rather than deciding what they'd already decided. All right, she said. All right, yes, he said, before he could stop himself. All right, I'll think about it, she said. And then, because she was Lenora, she added, and I'll tell you what I decide. Plainly. He nodded. His heart was doing something moderately embarrassing in his chest. He was 41 years old and had been married before, and this was still happening. Good, he said. That's good. She turned back to the window. He thought the conversation was over. He went to get his boots off. Then she said, without turning around, I like it here, Silas. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He stopped. More than I expected to, she said. I want you to know that. He stood there for a moment with one boot off and one boot on. I know, he said. Nellie told me. She turned then, and there was something in her face that was close to a smile, the real kind, not the careful kind she used when she was being polite. She told you that? She tells me most things, he said. Eventually, Lenora looked at the table, then back at him. The almost smile was still there. She told me, she said, that you need someone good at the coat kind of things. He felt that in a very specific place in his chest. She's not wrong, he said. Lenora looked at him for another moment, and then she did smile fully, and it changed her whole face in the way that real smiles change a face not performed, not managed, just real. Good night, Silas, she said. Good night, Lenora, he said. She went down the hall. He finished taking off his boot and sat on the bench by the door with one boot in his hand, staring at the middle distance of his own kitchen. Outside, the Idaho winter was doing what it always did, cold and relentless and entirely indifferent to what happened inside a farmhouse on the valley road. Inside, the stove burned. The lamp threw its yellow circle across the table where Nellie's slate sat with 3 completed problems and 1 erased. The pantry was organized. The drafts were sealed. Nellie's coat hung on its hook with no torn sleeve. The farm was still in debt. The work was never done. The spring would bring mud and repairs and the ongoing arithmetic of a struggling property. But Silas sat on the bench and held his boot and thought about a woman who had arrived with 1 trunk and no illusions, who had looked at his failing household without flinching and started making it stronger to 1 sealed gap at a time, and who had just told him plainly, which was the only way she knew, how that she liked being here. More than she expected. He put his boot down. He sat with that for a while. Outside it kept snowing. She made him wait 9 days. Not out of cruelty. Silas understood that, in the same way he'd come to understand most things about Lenora, not from her explaining herself, but from watching how she operated. She did not make decisions quickly because she did not make decisions carelessly. She had told him she would think about it properly, and that was exactly what she was doing. And the 9 days were the shape of that thinking made visible. He knew better than to press. He almost pressed twice. Once on the 4th day, when they were going over the February supply list together at the kitchen table, and she reached across him to correct a figure he'd written wrong, and her hand was 6 inches from his on the table, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and Nellie was asleep, and he thought, just ask again. He didn't. He corrected the figure. Once on the 7th day, when he came in from the barn and found her standing in the doorway of the back room, looking at the tin box on the shelf, the box with the water claim and Margaret's marriage certificate and everything else. and she didn't know he was there yet, and her expression was something private and careful, and he thought, what is she deciding? He went back outside for another 10 minutes instead. On the 9th day, a Tuesday, she came and found him. He was at the east fence line in the afternoon cold, replacing a post that had finally given up its fight with the frozen ground. He heard boots on the hard snow behind him and turned, and she was standing there in her heavy coat, with her hat pulled down against the wind, which was doing its usual February work of trying to make everything harder. She had not brought her journal. He noticed that. I've thought about it, she said. He straightened up from the fence post. He waited. I have some things I want to say before I answer, she said. Is that all? Yes, he said. She pulled her coat tighter, not from cold or not only from cold. I've left 2 households, she said. You know that. The agency told you. They did. What they didn't tell you is that both times I knew before I left that leaving was the right thing. Both times I walked into a situation that I'd been wrong about, and I had to choose between staying somewhere I'd been wrong about or starting over. She looked at him steadily. I don't want to make that mistake here. I don't want to say yes to something because I'm comfortable, and then discover comfort was the only thing I was saying yes to. He held her gaze. What are you saying yes to then? If you're saying yes. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. This is going to sound practical, she said. That's all right. I'm saying yes to the farm, she said. To the work of it, what needs doing, what I can contribute. I'm saying yes to Nellie, that's not a condition. I want you to know it's not a condition. I care about that child, and I need you to know I'm not going to treat her like a feature of the arrangement. She stopped, started again. I'm saying yes to you being someone I can disagree with, and it matters that you hear it. Both times before, when I disagreed, they tolerated it until they didn't. She looked at him with the directness she brought to everything. I need you to know who you're asking. I'm not going to become quieter over time. That's not something I know how to do. He stood at the fence line in the February cold and looked at this woman who had come to his house with one trunk and had spent 3 months making everything around her more honest. And he said, Lenora, I hired you because the agency told me you had strong opinions. You being quieter over time would be the only version of this that would disappoint me. Something happened in her face. Something cracked open, very slightly, not weakness. The opposite of weakness. Like a person who has been braced for something that didn't land and has to readjust. Right, she said. All right, he said. A pause. Yes, she said. My answer is yes. He let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding for 9 days. It made a small cloud in the cold air between them and dissipated. Good, he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. That's good. She looked at him for a moment with that expression that was not quite a smile, but lived right next to one. Is that all you're going to say? I'm still, he gestured vaguely. At the fence post, I'm in the middle of something. She looked at the fence post, then back at him. And she did smile then, the real one, the one that changed her face. Finish the fence, she said. He turned back to the post. He heard her boots on the snow going back toward the house, and he stood there for a moment with the post digger in his hands and the cold around him and the whole gray winter sky above the Idaho valley, and he thought, I'm not going to make that look like nothing happened. He put the post digger down. He turned around. Lenora. She stopped, turned back. He walked to her across the frozen ground. He was not a graceful man, and the ground was uneven, and he didn't care about any of that. He walked to her, and when he reached her, he did the thing he'd been not doing for 9 days, which was put his hand against her face, cold cheek, cold glove, and she looked up at him with those clear, direct eyes, and he kissed her. Once, carefully, in the February wind by the east fence line. She kissed him back, which was its own kind of answer. Most of its windows were dark. When they separated, she was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before, slightly undone, not in control of it, real in the way people are real when they stop managing themselves for a moment. Go finish your fence, she said. Her voice was different. He went and finished his fence. They told Nellie that evening, or rather, Nellie told them. They sat down at the kitchen table after supper with the specific posture of 2 adults who have agreed to say something important, and Nellie looked at both of them and said, before either of them opened their mouths, you talked today. At the fence, Silas looked at his daughter. How do you know that? I saw from the window, she said. You were doing your lessons. I was doing my lessons near the window, she said, without apparent guilt. Lenora made a sound that was absolutely a laugh and then composed her face again. Silas looked at her. She pressed her lips together. "We're going to get married," he said. He said it flat and clear because Nellie was 7 and deserved the plain version. Nellie looked at him, then at Lenora, then back at him. "I know," she said. He started. "I told you that you needed someone good at the coat things," she said to Lenora, with the air of someone reminding a person of a conversation they should remember. "And I told Papa to ask you." She picked up her fork. "So that part's done." Silas looked at his 7-year-old daughter, informing him that the most significant decision of the past 3 years had largely been managed by her, and would he please keep up? "You're all right with it," he said. "Not the arrangement." He meant, "You're all right. Are you really all right?" Nellie put her fork down. She looked at him with Margaret's eyes and her own particular wisdom, and she said, "Papa, she fixed my coat the real way. She's been here this whole time. I already decided." He looked at Lenora. Lenora was looking at Nellie with an expression he had no word for something that was love in its early form, when it's still a little raw and startling and not yet comfortable in its own skin. "When did you decide?" Lenora asked. "When you asked me for hot water the first night," Nellie said simply. "And then I checked, and I kept being right." A silence, but the warm kind. "You checked," Lenora said. "You always check right answers," Nellie said, with a 7-year-old's complete confidence that she was applying the lesson correctly. Silas picked up his coffee cup and drank from it, and said nothing because there was nothing to say. His daughter had outthought him again. He was beginning to accept this was going to be a recurring feature of his life. They were married in February, not at a church. The weather wouldn't allow the road to Cartwell Crossing, not that week, and neither of them pressed for postponing it. The local circuit preacher, a man named Aldous who traveled the valley in all weathers, and had married and buried half the county, came to the farm on a Thursday morning, and stood in the kitchen with Nellie between Silas and Lenora, and read the words that made the thing official. It was not a ceremony that anyone would have described as grand. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the breakfast that had just been cleaned up. Silas was in his good shirt, which Lenora had ironed the night before. Lenora wore the dark blue dress she'd had in her trunk since Ohio, which she'd kept for occasions she hadn't known at the time she was keeping it for. Nellie wore her repaired coat because she'd wanted to, which made no practical sense, and which neither adult suggested she change. Aldous read the words. They said what needed to be said. Outside snow was falling again, the soft, unhurried kind. When it was done, Nellie took both their hands. She didn't say anything. She just stood there between them, holding a hand on each side, and Silas felt his daughter's small cold fingers in his, and looked across her head at Lenora, who was looking back at him with the expression he was beginning to know as her private face, the one that didn't manage anything, the one she only wore when she'd stopped watching herself. Aldous had coffee and a piece of the apple cake Lenora had made the day before, and told them about 3 other families he'd married that winter, and left with the same comfortable practicality with which he'd arrived. After he was gone, the 3 of them stood in the kitchen, in the quiet. Nellie said, "Is it different now?" Silas thought about it. "Some things." "Which things?" "The important ones," Lenora said. Nellie seemed to accept this. She went to get her slate. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in Idaho, reluctantly, in stages, like it had other business, and would get there when it got there. First, the quality of the light changed. Before anything else, a shift in how the afternoon sat on the fields. Then the creek ice started at its edges, the thin parts going first. Then the yard mud that had been ironed for 4 months turned back into mud, which was actually something to be grateful for, even if you were the one who had to wade through it. Silas walked the property lines the first week of March, the way he did every spring, checking what the winter had taken and what had held. He did it alone, same as every year, and reported back to the house with his list. Lenora met him at the door with coffee and her own list, which was the household's winter damage assessment, what needed replacing in the pantry, what repairs the kitchen needed, where the insulation had failed, what Nellie had grown out of. They compared lists at the kitchen table. It was a practical thing. 2 lists, 1 table coffee, the morning coming in through the window. There was nothing romantic about it, and he was aware, sitting there, that this was actually the truest picture of what they'd agreed to, not the kitchen kiss, not the ceremony, but this. 2 people with their lists, figuring out what came next. He was also aware that he didn't mind this at all. The northeast fence needs 2 new posts, he said. The pantry is down to 3 months of flour if we don't restock before April, she said. Creeks moving. Freely. She looked up. They both knew what that meant. The water that had nearly been taken from them was running again, clean and indifferent, the same creek it had always been, belonging to no one who hadn't earned it. Good, she said. Yes, he said. She went back to her list. He went back to his. The garden was Lenora's first major project of the spring, and she approached it with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, which meant Silas came home one afternoon in late March to find the garden plot restaked, the soil turned in the section that had compacted worst over winter, and a paper on the kitchen table with a planting plan drawn out in her even handwriting. What to plant where, what rotated from last year's positions, what new additions she was proposing, and why. He stood at the table and looked at the plan for a long moment. This is twice the size, he said. The east section has been sitting unplanted for 2 years, she said, from where she was washing her hands at the basin. The soil is better than the sections you've been using. You've been working the harder ground. Why didn't you plant it last year? Because last year I wasn't sure I was staying, she said, simply without drama. You don't plant a 2-year crop when you might not be here in 2 years. He looked at the plan. He thought about what it meant that she was planting it now. That was its own kind of declaration, longer and quieter than vows in a kitchen, but just as real. I don't know most of these, he said, pointing to a section she'd labeled with a word he didn't recognize. Parsnips. They take a full season. They're worth it. Have you grown them before? In Ohio. They do well in cold ground. He nodded. He was aware that the garden plan on the table was already an argument for something. For the future of this place being different from its recent past. For the idea that a struggling farm could become something that planned ahead, that grew things that took a full season because it expected to be here in a full season. Do what you think is right, he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. I will, she said. I just thought you should see it first. He appreciated that. He always had the way she offered him the chance to be part of decisions that she probably could have made alone. It was a form of respect that he'd only recognized as such after a few months of receiving it. The parsnips go in the east section, he said. The rest looks good. She nodded and dried her hands and came to the table to add a notation to the plan. He watched her write and thought about something Cobb Darnell had said to him 2 weeks ago when Silas had told him about the marriage. Cobb had stood in his yard in the early spring light and been quiet for a moment and then said, You know, half the county thought you'd lost your mind, hiring her. I know, Silas had said, and now you've married her. Yes. Cobb had looked at him with something that was not quite envy and not quite admiration. The syndicate, he said. The accounts. The house running right, he paused. What was it the agency said she was? Too educated, Silas said. Cobb made a sound. Too educated for what? That, Silas had said, is an excellent question. He thought about that now, watching Lenora annotate her garden plan. Too educated. For what, exactly? For a struggling farm that needed every advantage it could find. For a child who deserved a mind that could meet hers. For an exhausted man who needed someone who would look at a problem and not flinch. Too educated. For whom? April brought mud, and then warmth, and then the first green things, and the garden Lenora had planned began doing what gardens do when someone actually tends them properly, not magically, not without the usual failures and setbacks, and the 3 rows that didn't take and had to be replanted but steadily, with the particular persistence of things that have been set into good ground. Parsnips went in. Nellie helped plant them on a Saturday, crouching in the east section with her hands in the soil, placing the seeds at the spacing Lenora specified, asking questions the whole time. Why this far apart? Why this deep? What happens if you plant them too close? They compete, Lenora said, for the same water, the same nutrients. They slow each other down. So they need room to grow their own way, Nellie said. Exactly. Nellie pressed the last seed into the earth and patted the soil over it with both palms. Like people, she said. Lenora looked at her. Yes, she said. Like people. Nellie stood up and brushed her hands on her skirt and looked at the east section with satisfaction. She was 8 now. Her birthday had been in March, a Thursday, and Lenora had made her a cake with the particular seriousness she brought to anything she did for Nellie, and had also given her a book she'd sent away for from a bookseller in Boise, a natural science primer with illustrations. Nellie had carried it to bed that night and read it by candlelight past when she was supposed to sleep. Silas had seen the light under her door and not knocked. He'd gone to bed thinking about that light under the door, about a child reading past her bedtime because she couldn't put the book down, about the reader he'd ridden into town to buy back in November when Lenora first started lessons, which felt like something from a different chapter of his life, but was less than 6 months ago. He'd thought, this is what it was supposed to look like. Not perfect, not without the debt and the mud and the ongoing arithmetic of a working farm. But this, the light under the door, the book in her hands, the mind turning pages because it wanted more. This is what it was supposed to look like. In May, Silas paid the second quarterly installment on the mortgage, and the number on the ledger was $60 lower than it had been the May before, without the farm taking in any significantly more income. The difference was the reorganized accounts, the feed purchased at the better price, the waste reduced. The $42 from Ashcraft he'd written off has gone, but which he'd mentioned to Hollis in Clearwater, who'd mentioned it to someone else, and at the end of a chain of mentions that Silas would never fully trace. $20 of it had come back to him from a small claims settlement he hadn't known he was party to. $50 against $430. It was not a dramatic victory, but Lenora had shown him the projection on paper if the margin held, if the garden expanded its pansidan, if the livestock numbers stayed where they were, and the projection said 4 years. 4 years and the mortgage was clear. He'd looked at that number for a long time. 4 years had been inconceivable. In November he'd been running on will and nothing else, and the future had been a place he tried not to look at directly because it mostly looked like more of the same weight. 4 years was a different kind of future. 4 years was Nellie at 12. 4 years was a farm without a debt payment, taking a third of everything. 4 years was something. He'd folded the projection and put it in the tin box, next to the water claims and the marriage certificate and the syndicate's retreat letter. The box was getting full. He thought that might be the best sign he'd had in years. Summer came, and the creek ran clean all through it, the same creek that had nearly been taken from them, moving through the northeastern boundary of the Redfern property, the same way it had moved since before Silas owned this land. He used it for the garden, for the livestock, for the well in the dry weeks of August. He thought about it, sometimes about what the farm would have looked like without it, about the family named Pruitt over the ridge, who had $60 where their water access used to be. He'd gone to see Elmer Pruitt in March, after the snow cleared enough to ride. Gisden's went dark. He'd taken Lenora notes from the county records office and laid out what she'd found, explained the filing dates and the pencil notation and what it actually meant, versus what the syndicate's letter had implied. Told Elmer about the response letter clean, no threats, just facts and what had happened after. Elmer had listened with the expression of a man being told something that doesn't help him, but that he needs to hear anyway. 6 months ago. I know, Silas said. I didn't come to tell you what you should have done. Then why'd you come? Silas thought about it. Because the next family they send a letter to should know before they sign, he said. And you talk to more people in this valley than I do. Elmer had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd said, Who told you to do this? The woman from Ohio? No, Silas said. She told me I could tell families about the county records. Knowing to check them, he paused. This part coming to you, specifically, that was me. Elmer had nodded slowly. $60, he said, and there was a flatness in his voice that was not quite bitterness, but was what bitterness settles into when it's been sitting for 6 months. I thought they knew something I didn't. They knew you wouldn't check, Silas said. That's all they knew. Elmer passed that around the valley in the following months. Silas didn't know exactly what he said, or to whom, but by summer, there were 3 families who'd received letters from the syndicate and contacted Hollis at the title office before responding, and Hollis had written Silas a short note saying he thought the trend was moving in the right direction, and he was grateful for whatever Silas had started. Silas had showed Lenora the note. She'd read it. Set it down. You did that, she said. We found the information, then, he said. She shook her head, not in disagreement, but in the way she did, when she thought he was using we to avoid taking credit. I found the information in the records, she said. You decided what to do with it. Those are different things. considered this. He thought about the 2 months where he'd held the syndicate's letter face down on the kitchen table, because he couldn't face what it might mean. He thought about how close he'd come to not checking. "I almost didn't check," he said. "I know," she said. "But you did." He looked at her. "'Cause you told me to, thought. "I told you the deed existed and that it was worth reading," she said. "You could have ignored that. Plenty of men would have." She paused. "You're not giving yourself enough credit, Silas." He thought about this for a while. He thought about the particular kind of man he'd been for 3 years before November, capable, stubborn, working hard, but reactive, narrowed by grief and debt, and the sheer volume of what needed doing into a version of himself that stopped looking up long enough to see what else was possible. He thought about a woman walking into his house with one trunk, and the patience to wait while he figured out what he was asking. "I think we're not giving either of us enough credit," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to what she'd been writing, which was her version of agreement. That fall, Silas built the shelf. He'd been thinking about it since summer. In the background way, he thought about building projects, measuring with his eyes, estimating materials, deciding what it needed to be. He did it in October, when the harvest was in. The days were shortening, and there was room in the work schedule for something that wasn't strictly necessary. He built it in the kitchen, on the wall beside the window where the afternoon light came in. Good pine boards, sanded smooth. Brackets set level, he checked them 3 times. Long enough for 30 books if you packed them, 20 if you didn't. He said nothing about it while he was building it. Lenora watched him measure and cut and fit and nail, and said nothing either, which meant she understood what it was without being told. Nellie came home from her afternoon reading to find it finished. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it. She walked to it slowly and ran her hand along the front edge of the wood. "Is this for books?" she said. "Yes," Silas said. She turned and looked at him, then at Lenora, who was at the table watching. "How many books do we have?" she said. Currently, Lenora said 14, not counting the primers. Nellie looked at the shelf. It held 14 books with room for more. Much more. "We'll need more books," she said. "We'll get more books," Silas said. Nellie turned back to the shelf and stood there for another moment. Then she started moving books from the stack on the table, the stack that had been a stack since November because there'd been no shelf to put them on, and placing them on the new wood one by one, in the order she apparently had decided they should go, which was not alphabetical, and not by size to size, but by some internal system that made sense to an 8-year-old, and that neither adult questioned. When she was done, she stepped back and looked at the shelf with the critical eye of a person who has spent months reading books off a table and has opinions about vertical storage. "It's good," she said. Silas looked at the shelf. 14 books on new pine boards in a kitchen that had sealed drafts and organized pantry shelves, and 2 people who'd figured out how to be something to each other that neither of them had expected. He'd built it for books. That was all. But he knew, standing there, that it was also something else. It was the visible proof of a decision made in November, when he'd hired a woman the agency warned him about, when he'd taken a risk on someone's strong opinions, and trusted that the difficulty the agency had described was actually something else. The shelf was what you built when you believed the future was going to need more room. Winter came back around the way winters do. The second winter with Lenora in the house was different from the first, not because the cold was less or it wasn't, but because the house was ready for it. All the work were dark. All the work of the first year, the sealed gaps, and the organized stores and the accounts brought under control meant that December arrived and found the Redfern farm prepared for it instead of simply enduring it. Nellie's lessons had expanded. Lenora had written to a bookstore in Portland for a mathematics text that went further than what was available in Cartwell Crossing, and Nellie had been working through it since September with the focus, someone who had found something that fit the shape of her mind. She was 8 years old and working problems that challenged students twice her age, not because she was being pushed, but because she was pulling, asking for more, coming back with the answers before Lenora expected them, then asking what came next. Lenora had mentioned this to Silas one evening in November, sitting at the kitchen table after Nellie was in bed. She'd mentioned it carefully, the way she mentioned things that had implications she wasn't sure he'd considered. "She's going to need more than I can give her in another year or 2, she said. He looked at her. More than you can give her. Mathematically. Possibly in other subjects too, she paused. There's a school in Boise. Her academy. Girls are admitted. Another pause. It would mean her boarding during terms. He sat with this. The idea of Nellie and Boise away from the farm was something he hadn't considered yet. She was 8. It felt both very far away and not far enough away. How long before she'd need it, he said. 2 years. Maybe 3. He nodded slowly. And the cost? I've looked into it, she said. And of course she had. She had the numbers already, which she showed him. It was not impossible. Not with the debt coming down and the farm running more efficiently. Not if they planned for it. He looked at the numbers. He thought about the shelf in the kitchen with 14 books on it and the promise that there would be more. He thought about Nellie placing them in her own order and saying, "We'll need more books," like it was simply a fact about the future. "We have 2 years," he said. "We'll figure it out." Lenora looked at him with the expression he'd come to know as her version of relief. She didn't show relief dramatically. But there was a particular quality of stillness in her when something she'd been carrying got set down. "I wasn't sure you'd want her to go," she said. "I want her to have what she needs," he said, "even if that's further away than I'd like." She nodded. She reached across and put her hand over his on the table. Not a grand gesture, a quiet one. The kind that doesn't mean this is a moment, but just means I'm here, and I know what you just said, and it matters. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a few minutes, while the stove worked against the November cold and the shelf on the kitchen wall held its 14 books, and somewhere down the hall, Nellie was either asleep or reading by candlelight, and both of those options were fine because both of them were Nellie being exactly who she was. The North Fork Development Syndicate sent no further letters to the Redfern farm. To other farms in the valley, Silas eventually heard, they did a family named Calloway in the spring, another named Briggs the following fall. But Hollis at the title office had gotten efficient at advising people to check their deeds, and the word Elmer Pruitt had done its work, and the syndicate found the Cartwell Crossing Valley less profitable than it had seemed from Clearwater, with its intimidating stationery and its borrowed authority. Silas never heard what happened to Bramwell Vane specifically. He didn't particularly want to. He'd spent some months wanting to know, wanting the shape of an ending that included some accounting for what had been done to the Pruitts and how close it had come to being done to him. But accountability in the world doesn't always arrive in the form you'd recognize, and at some point he'd let go of the wanting and focused on what was in front of him. What was in front of him was this, a farm that was 3 years from being free of debt, a daughter who was becoming a person he was slightly awed by, a woman he'd married in a kitchen in February, who had never, not once, become quieter. The community that had watched him with a certain cautious concern in November, a struggling widower hiring a difficult educated woman, what was he thinking, had shifted its assessment by the following year, the way communities do when the evidence piles up. Mrs. Boone had become something approaching an advocate, which mostly meant she told anyone who seemed inclined to have an opinion about the Redfern household that Lenora Whitcomb Redfern was one of the more sensible women in the valley, and Mrs. Boone's opinions moved through Cartwell crosses with considerable force. Cobb Darnell's changed opinion was less elegant but more useful. He told people the Redfern farm was the best managed place in the district, and that Silas had made the smartest hire he'd ever made, even if Silas himself hadn't fully understood what he was hiring. This was accurate enough that Silas couldn't argue with it. Hollis at the title office sent a Christmas card that year. In it he'd written, "Your Miss Whitcomb, or Mrs. Redfern, I should say may have saved more farms in this valley than she'll ever know. Best of the season to your household." Silas showed it to Lenora. She read it, set it down. Said, "That's kind of him," in the tone she used when she was more affected by something than she wanted to show. He put the card on the shelf, between 2 books. The things that don't get resolved are the ones nobody talks about in the straightforward version of a story. The debt didn't disappear. It came down year by year, but it was there. The work didn't get easier. The farm still had its brutal seasons and its failures, and the ongoing negotiation with weather that didn't care what you'd planned. There were weeks when Silas and Lenora disagreed sharply about how to handle a difficult supply situation one spring, how firmly to respond when Nellie pushed against a boundary she found inconvenient, A decision about the livestock in the second year that Silas made, and Lenora thought was wrong, and said so and was right about. Those arguments didn't resolve neatly. They resolved the way most real arguments do, with both people being partly right and partly wrong, and having to decide whether the disagreement was bigger than the thing they were building together. It wasn't. That was the thing. Not that they agreed, not that they were perfectly suited, not that the farm became something from a storybook, but that the disagreements were never bigger than the thing they were building together. That was what made it work. Lenora never did become quieter. He never asked her to. He'd meant it when he said it at the fence line in February, and he'd meant it every year after that. Her opinions were the same engine that had looked at a syndicate's intimidating letter and seen it for what it was. You didn't ask that to be smaller. You asked it to be part of what you were doing. And Nellie, who had stood on a cold porch in November with bare feet and a torn coat and looked at a strange woman and asked if she wanted hot water. Nellie, who had carried a stub of pencil in her pocket because she'd prepared. Nellie stirred to the left and checked right answers and watched from the window and told her father what he needed to hear because she was tired of waiting for him to figure it out. Nellie grew. Not in the storybook way, not in a way that was clean or linear or without its own difficulties. She grew the way children grow when they have room, and someone paying attention unevenly, stubbornly, brilliantly. She grew into her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and Lenora's particular habit of looking at a problem sideways until it showed you its weak point. She went to the academy in Boise at 10, which was earlier than Lenora had estimated, and later than Silas would have chosen if he were the one deciding. She cried at the stage stop on the first day, and then composed herself with the precise dignity of a child who has decided the crying was legitimate but is now done. She wrote home every week, without fail letters that started formal and got longer and more like herself as the weeks went on, full of what she was learning, and who she'd met, and questions about the farm and instructions for how Lenora should manage the parsnips in her absence. Silas kept every letter. He put them in the tin box that had once held only the documents of survival, the deed, the water claim, the syndicate's retreat. Box kept filling up. He thought about getting a bigger box. He didn't. He liked that it was full. On the farm, the shelf in the kitchen filled up the same way. Slowly, book by book, year by year, the empty space disappeared. Nellie brought books home from Boise. Lenora ordered them from Portland. Silas, who had never been a particular reader, found himself standing at the shelf on winter evenings, sometimes, pulling something out, reading a few pages before the lamp burned too low. He would not have predicted this about himself. That was, he'd come to understand the point. You did not predict what you were going to need from a life. You hired someone the agency warned you about, and she sealed the gaps and kept the accounts and sat at the county records office for 2 hours until she found the thing that saved you. And then one Tuesday afternoon, at a fence line, she said, yes. And you built a shelf for the books you didn't know you were going to have yet. And years later, when the debt was finally clear, and Nellie had grown into someone extraordinary, and the farm became the kind of place people pointed to as an example of what a homestead could be, it's the thing Silas most remembered about the November, when it all started, was not the syndicate's letter, not the water rights, not the accounts. He remembered a woman stepping off a wagon with one trunk and no illusions, looking at his film farm and his quiet daughter and his cold kitchen and deciding it was enough to work with. He remembered a 7-year-old with a stub of pencil already in her pocket. He remembered that the agency had warned him she was too educated, and he'd hired her anyway. And his daughter had asked her to stay forever, and she had some decisions are like that. You don't know making them, what you're actually choosing. You just know something in you says yes to the risk when the sensible voice says wait. Silas Redfern had not been a man who listened to that voice. Not for a long time. He was glad every year that followed that he'd listened that once.